Let's get in to the stream tonight and let's talk about our first topic here, which is admittedly about a week old or 2 weeks old, but it is something that's kind of important because of course, a lot of things have changed since, well, basically every announcement of a Star Wars movie, but especially the 2023 slate of Star Wars movies that was announced at Celebration 2023 in London. So we have kind of two landmark dates for announcements recently with Star Wars. There was the Investors Day in 2020, where they did the live stream and announced all the big projects coming to Lucasfilm, mostly on Disney Plus, but a few films, a few things here and there, like Indiana Jones 5. And then we got the 2023 announcements as the streaming was starting to come to a close, as people were kind of disillusioned with some of the things that were coming out from Lucasfilm. A little bit of frustration was brewing. When are we getting some films from Lucasfilm for Star Wars? They finally announced three new movies at that time. There was the Rey New Jedi Order movie, the Dawn of the Jedi movie directed by James Mangold, and the Dave Filoni movie that was going to be the capper of everything from The Mandalorian, including season 3 of The Mandalorian and Ahsoka seasons 1 and 2. So all those things were announced. Out of all of them, there's none of them close to coming out, really. We know the Rey movie has had, I believe, 3 writers at this point. It continues to change and evolve and shift. And since then, we've had the Damon Lindelof, I mean, not Damon Lindelof, Simon Kinberg project get greenlit, which possibly ties into that. We now have the Sean Levy movie, Star Wars Starfighter, scheduled to come out in 2027 in May. So that has shifted, with Avengers getting shifted from May 2026 and May 2027 to now December 2026 and December 2027. Avengers Secret Wars has taken the exact same release date, December 17th, 2027, that a Star Wars movie, one of those three that was announced in 2023, was scheduled for. So if you follow Star Wars news, if you follow the production process of these films, it doesn't sound like any of them are close to being ready to go. Dave Filoni was on record at Celebration talking about how his movie's coming still, but he still is mostly just in the idea phase of his film. He doesn't have concrete information written down. He doesn't have the story fully ready to go, but he's waiting to see how things work out with the Mandalorian and Grogu and with Ahsoka season 2. Will there be Ahsoka season 3? Will there be multiple Mandalorian and Grogu movies before we get Filoni's movie? I think that one's the one that seems the furthest away. You have the Rey movie, which is in flux because there are so many other things coming from the Rey post Rise of Skywalker universe. That one seems up in the air with what their plan ultimately is. And then you have Dawn of the Jedi, which seems the closest, and I think would have been the 2027, December 2027 movie, but yet has continually been moved back from when we've heard rumors of production starting. So that's another one that's kind of just up in the air whether it's coming out anytime soon. So, Sonic, when you hear that Star Wars has lost its December 17th, 2027 release date, I'm sure it doesn't surprise you, but what do you think that movie was actually going to be? And do you think it comes out in 2028 now, or is this just a thing where they're kind of getting rid of all the Star Wars dates and we're going to just slowly hear about them as the films actually progress and get closer and closer to actually going into production?
It's a tough one because on one hand, I'm very happy now that Mandalorian Grogu is not gonna be fighting in the same time space as an Avengers movie. Yes, even if the MCU is nowhere near its prime, its peak, it's still entering an era where once everything with Doomsday and Secret Wars pans out, however it does, people are still talking about, like, "I still wanna see X-Men, I still wanna see, like, a fully realized version, more so than the ones in the 2000s." So they have a couple more things that they can throw at people to get them all excited and really buzzing about that franchise. So for them to be like, okay, you know what? Like everything that's been coming out of Doomsday, they're taking their time with it. It's exciting, everyone's meeting up and all that, but how are you gonna make it by May 2026? Well, you're not, right? So it's nice that that we have this kind of setting of May being kind of fully freed open, just letting Mandalorian Grogu, which is basically a glorified TV film with just a little bit more extra polish and time to, really see and stand, like, with the franchise and how people are gonna react to it, right? Like, this is not a movie anybody necessarily wanted, right? There's plenty of people who are clamoring for season 4 of The Mandalorian who are like, "Yeah, we can just get this adapted there, continue, and then flesh out into that New Republic film," Filoni is saying. So, now that this is now has no excuses to, like, really operate, like, it has all the freedom. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that everything with the timeline in December 2027 and all that, it hinges on this, right? Like, okay, can we pull something off here? Will this be making 700, 800 million? If it does, then yeah, I mean, there's still a chance of something in like early 2028. I know like a lot of the early Mangled stuff that was coming out was like that he was actively working on it, that he seemed to be making more progress. It seemed like Dawn was leapfrogging Ray's New Jedi Order. Now it's not, right? So it's like, okay, the more the recent news, I know, we're still working on these things. We wanna make it as unique as possible. It's gotta be so different from the rest of Star Wars, but still familiar. It's a trickier film to pull off, and Rey's New Jedi Order is seemingly gonna be a little bit more dependent on stuff like Starfighter, on the Last Order book, just kinda seeing what this post Episode 9 galaxy looks like and how people respond to it in different mediums, and my gut is telling me Starfighter will do well, and, we're gonna maybe see that, get pushed to the early 2028 slot, and then we'll push Dawn and New Jedi Order to whenever it needs to come out. So, yeah, I do agree in that sense. Yeah, they're just trying to get rid of all those dates that they put. But it is also absolutely just dependent on how well the Marvel franchise continues to, like, rebound, like, there's been reports that because of Thunderbolts not doing so well internationally the last couple of weeks, now that more new movies have been coming out, its legs have been chopped there. It's a bunch of C, D tier characters that, are very lovable now because of this film, but are from Disney Plus shows where Disney Plus was almost treated like an extension of the cinema, right? And it never was. It's the same issue that happened in the 50s and 60s when TV was first coming up. It's cheaper. We can do everything that you can do in the movies, but with less, and it never worked out that way. The only difference is now there aren't like people like clamoring to stop that from happening on TV. Now it's like it's just a bubble. It burst, and now we have to kind of deal with it. So yeah, I don't see any Star Wars film coming up in 2027. I see Star Wars having, for once, like, just a clean slate under Disney to be like, "Okay, what are you gonna do? This is like how it was when we had December basically cleared out for you for the sequels. Show us what you got," right? We don't run into that Solo issue, and I think this is gonna be only good for that film regardless of its reception. I think it's gonna leg out quite well because of that, and on top of that, if it does well, if it's got critical reception and all that, then yeah, I mean, great. The rest of the Star Wars films, I think, will get pushed even harder into development and be like, "Look, we don't need to do anything crazy. Just take your time with it. Be honest about what you're coming out with, and I think people will respond. People are clamoring for it, right?" Now the question is, will this delay also benefit Doomsday, and will it benefit Secret Wars? If it does, then I think we start running back into the same problem, like, okay, well, which month does Star Wars have again? Do we let Marvel take over the May month again, or do we push everything in Star Wars back to December, kinda how Disney has been doing from the start? I don't know. That's a question 5, 6 years down the line once we really know the state of the story and once we really know just how far we are into the Mandiverse and everything. But I mean, I think this is only positive news. I'm not really worried about the 2027 slate. I'm more worried about the 2026 slate. Next year is gonna be a behemoth year for movies. There are definitely movies that are gonna be eating each other up. I think Disney just made the wise choice of being like, "Yeah, this is not necessarily a wanted film, but if we let it have time to breathe, if we let it be polished, if we don't try to cannibalize it, this will only do even more wonders for the rest of our slate, for the rest of our franchises." So pretty exciting, news, but yeah, if you're someone who's looking at these dates and stuff that they put during investor days at Celebration, I think this is, like, the final nail in the coffin of, like, don't trust any of that until you hear and see them on set doing something. From there,
Yeah.
then you can start getting your hopes up.
No, definitely. I think this, completely kills everything from that 2023 announcement. And it's very well that it has. I mean, at this point, it's been running on life support. We've talked about the Ray movie countless times on these news streams, and like, it's not going to come out anytime soon. And I think at this point, we should just cut all the release dates from these scheduled Star Wars movies, and then we'll hear about them as they come. I mean, I think in general, right, one of the reasons they scheduled release dates for Star Wars was just because Star Wars has been up in or kind of up in the air with its release date schedule. It hasn't necessarily picked and stuck with a certain month. December was that time because 4 out of the 5 movies that they released between 2015 and 2019 all came out in December, but then Solo came out in May, Memorial Day weekend, which is when the other 6 Star Wars live action movies came out, and it bombed, but yet those movies all did well at that time. I think Memorial Day honestly has become a pretty mediocre place to release movies until this year. We haven't seen very many in the last 5, 6, 7 years really blow up on Memorial Day weekend. And I think it's mostly the trend of like you can't just put out anything and expect it to do well anymore. Like it has to be at least pretty good or good enough, or in Lilo and Stitch's case, like a family movie, something that's marketed pretty well and targeted at families. But I think December, the reason Avengers has moved to December, there are a couple reasons. I mean, I think one is they needed more time. It absolutely makes sense because they barely started shooting a year before the movie comes out. There's no way they could have finished all of that, plus shoot both movies back to back if that's their plan, plus post-production, plus VFX, plus everything, editing the film, promotion, press, all of that in a year. So they needed the extra time, but I think the big thing is you've seen now the December release date has just become probably the most bankable one in all of film. It's the one that has less competition. Mostly everything kind of comes out around the same time. And it's kind of a bloodbath for a couple weeks, but then eventually, once Christmas hits and New Year's hits, 1 or 2 movies reign supreme over the rest. And Disney saw that last year with Mufasa, which did not do well its opening weekend but ended up making a lot of money because it stayed in that conversation. It stayed in the theaters for 2 months or so after it came out and just kept making money every single week. And you don't get that in the summer. You don't get that in May because there are so many movies coming out. Movies are expensive nowadays. People have to pick and choose which ones they want to see. So you can't rely on people going back multiple times. Whereas in December, nothing really comes out in January. So if you can make it through the bloodbath that is the week before Christmas, 2 week before Christmas release date, and Christmas Day release dates, and you are still in that top 5, you can make a lot of money. So I think Avengers is going for that. Spider-Man No Way Home released then, and it made a lot of money. So I think they expect to make the money there. Now, I think the real question is Star Wars going to be able to capture that like Lilo and Stitch box office on Memorial Day weekend? Because a lot of Disney releases in the last few years, Disney's always kind of dominated Memorial Day weekend in the last 10, 15 years. And their releases have been hit and miss in terms of money. Solo did not make anything, and that was a Memorial Day weekend release. They've released things on Memorial Day weekend, original stuff like Tomorrowland, which made nothing. They released Pirates of the Caribbean 5, which didn't do that well on Memorial Day weekend. They've done a lot of Memorial Day releases and not made their money back. But then this year, Lilo and Stitch made a lot of money. Granted, it's a live action Disney remake that is one with less controversy prior to it coming out than Snow White, and pretty much all the ones that have had no controversy around it and just moderate reviews, those have all done well. So it might be the outlier, but I'm wondering how The Mandalorian does. And I think it doesn't have to be a $1 billion movie, but it can definitely be a movie that really attributes its success and its crowd from people getting back into the habit of going to the theaters on that weekend, because that's been a weekend that hasn't necessarily been one that's consistent with movie going in the last few years. Like Furiosa came out on that weekend last year and it bombed. So there are a lot of things that could go wrong, but I'm glad Star Wars has the space now. I think Disney, one of the things you can look at with Thunderbolts too, I don't think it's quite the same audience, but Thunderbolts having Lilo and Stitch come out 3 weeks after it doesn't help when you're cannibalizing your own box office, right? So There are a lot of things they can look at there, but with Pixar usually having a movie 2 weeks into June, I wonder if Mandalorian and Grogu moves up to the Avengers release date, and if Starfighter moves up to the Avengers release date as maybe a more consistent release date that movies continually make money on is that first week of May, and then you have all of May to run. We'll see if they decide to do that, but I do think Starfighter's coming out in May 2027 for sure. I think to announce that now, you are basically they announced it a month ago. They have to be pretty confident that that's still the release date to announce it now. Otherwise, you would say it's coming in 2027 and we'll just see when it comes out. But they announced a full release date. So I think that is coming out at that time. Hopefully, it still works for the film itself. I don't think that one will get delayed. I think it was Dawn of the Jedi planned for or December 2027. Originally, I think the Ray movie was planned for December 2026, and that got pushed, that got moved, and the Filoni movie was planned for May 2026, and that got changed to The Mandalorian and Grogu. So all these dates are up in the air, but I do think it'll benefit all parties, and I think it's very important for the Star Wars Marvel fandoms. They do have a lot of crossover. It made really no sense to have a Star Wars movie coming out 3 weeks after Avengers, and it also made no sense for Avengers to have a Star Wars movie right there next to it, piggybacking off of it. So I don't think it would have helped either one. So I think it's a good thing both moved, but yeah, at this point, it's good to just kind of lay to rest the idea of these 2023 Star Wars movies even coming out anytime soon. At this point, they're on life support, and hopefully they come out at some point, but I won't believe it until we actually see it. We've got Jerome Villar saying, wondering, do you think Star Wars benefits or suffers from not having a clear Kevin Feige style figure leading the entire franchise? It's a good question, Jerome. I think it's a little bit twofold. One is that Star Wars, the projects around Star Wars have not been in a consistent singular story like the MCU, where, yeah, you could have a prequel film or you have a film that might take place, come out, 1 month, and then 3 months later, you have a film that comes out and it actually takes place before the film that came out before it. You can have that type of stuff along the timeline with the MCU, but it's mostly linear. It mostly continuously moves, and that allows somebody with that kind of architect style, like a Kevin Feige, to plan and strategize his pieces and oversee all the movies at once because most of them are all leading to the same direction. With Star Wars, if you're going to do Andor in the Dark Times, and then you're going to do Simon Kinberg that's coming out at post Rise of Skywalker, and then you're going to do Mandalorian and Grogu, which is New Republic, and then you decide to do Old Republic, which is 1,000 years before that. It's hard to have one person in charge of all of it. But what I think they do need are singular people in charge of different eras and different time periods. It doesn't mean you can't have your own original projects like an Andor, like have a Tony Gilroy, who it's basically a creator driven show that he's in charge of. It's not to say you can't have that, but if you're going to have the New Republic era and make this whole Mandalorian universe, might as well take John Favreau or Dave Filoni out of the consistent on-set writing process and make them the architect of the whole thing, or both of them if you want to, and have other people start directing these movies. That can be run like the MCU. If you go and do the Old Republic and you decide to have 2 or 3 shows going on at the same time and a couple movies, that needs an architect. So I think they need multiple people. It's not just one person overall, because Star Wars spans so many different time periods, so many different styles, so many different genres that you really do need different people in charge of each facet. Whereas the MCU has basically become its own genre of superhero film. It's a subgenre of superhero film. It has similar comedy, it has similar style, similar shot selection, similar look. Everything is very similar because Kevin Feige's overseeing everything.
Yeah, I think the key word of architect is probably the most important part because Jerome, when you're saying like, why don't we have like a unified head? Why don't we have someone in charge? I mean, we did. It was George Lucas, right? Like for the longest time, that was how it worked out. Yes, he didn't really care much in the later part of the '80s and most of the '90s of what people were writing. Kind of just said like, oh, change that character's name. We're like, "Oh, that's a cool idea," or just change this and that, right? Like, that's kinda how he treated a lot of his extended material. Definitely the stories that he was involved in, he was there. He was shaping it very actively, and like I said, some of these other stories, like New Jedi Order, like, supposedly he came in and he's like, "Anakin has to die. Anakin Solo has to die because 'cause I'm working on the prequels to Anakin Skywalker right now," right? That's one of the biggest rumors of that era. So he can come and he can shape these things, but we live in a world that's now 12 years removed from everything that happened with the Disney sale, right? And at that point, people are like, "Ah, George Lucas should not be in charge of Star Wars. He's ruining Star Wars." I mean, what is it? Revenge of the Fanboys and all of these different the People versus George Lucas and all that. Like, I think people forget just how easily we were as a society just attacking him, right? And making stuff to attack him with, not just forums, but like movies, right? And some very disgusting movies. There's some things I've seen from Revenge of the Nerds or whatever that one was going to the premiere of episode one. There's stuff that has not aged at all well. And yeah, I mean, we did have that unified head, and it was great until it wasn't, because once episode 1 came out, people were like, "Oh, okay, that's not great." And then episode 2 came out, they're like, "Oh, I hate it even more, like, all that stuff doesn't make any sense from episode 1. Why would he even do that?" 3 was the only thing that was, like, kinda calmish, but even then, I mean, if you're already a hater for the first 2 of the prequels, you didn't really care much about 3. It was just for the people who were like, "Oh, I get to finally see Darth Vader, I get to finally see the Empire come about," and stuff like that. It was a close. So I think he also got a little bit of grace during that period. Now 20 years later, we've got people going to 40X screenings and all that, cheering and calling this their second favorite or favorite Star Wars film out there, and it has aged remarkably well, but yeah, what one unified head, we've seen that it doesn't always work, and like Liam said, we need an architect, but we need architects for eras. Like, we need not showrunners, we almost need, like, era runners, right? So, the New Republic stuff, yeah, I mean, why not have Favreau and Filoni take a step back and be that, and then let other voices come in? If anything, that would rejuvenate it even more. Probably let, like, a lot of smaller projects kinda work out there, and then you can flesh it out, and then you can connect everything. And I think that would make sense. There's always been huge talks about, like, no, Star Wars needs to really push for, like, that HBO level past just what we saw in Andor, with like an Old Republic series, which would be fantastic because there's so much story and lore there. But a huge critique of that era is that none of it really syncs up or lines up. You just kind of hand wave stuff from Tales of the Jedi to stuff that's going on with, Knights of the Old Republic, and then suddenly you've got Star Wars: The Old Republic, and then there's huge gaps with the new Sith Wars and all that, and it's stretched over 4,000 years, and you're like, "Does that even make sense?" By the time we get to Bane, like, it's just a different story. It doesn't really feel like it's supposed to be the end of that Old Republic era entering into the early prequel era, right? So, yeah, no, like, having someone who's in charge of that, sees all that stuff, sees that's what inspired everything in Legends, and then now we're like, "Okay, how do we organize it? How do we simplify it? What do we add from canon that's already there that'd be cool connections? What do we just kinda combine together?" Like, those are things that you don't do when you're actively writing a script and working on a set, and you're very creatively driven about one specific project like, yeah, Tony Gilroy was, right? Like, he that was his baby, that was his focus. He's talking about like, "Hey, that was awesome for me. I wanna go back to directing something next." Never say never to Star Wars, but I need to direct something because that is also a huge, huge thing to be in charge of all that. Technically, we have Filoni as our CCO, but there's always been rumors, and now it's becoming a little bit more overt that, he hasn't apparently talked to, Timothy Zahn, even though he's gonna be handling Thrawn in a very Heir to the Empire-esque story for the end of the Mandoverse. Despite the announcement in 2023, "Oh, he's gonna be a consultant, I wanna make sure I only talk to him because he understands the character and everything." Some recent cons show that Zahn's like, "No, I'm been completely locked out of the process," which is terrifying to hear. And then you've got other things going on, like, hell, even side characters like the Mandalorians that were stuck on Mandalore after the purge, he's not even letting people have access to that for, like, side stories or comics or something to, like, kind of flesh out the Mandoverse, to kinda just do stuff that isn't consequential to the overall plot and story, but is really important to an era of Star Wars that just doesn't feel like it's always getting fleshed out. We get big pieces, but we don't really get connective tissue. So, would like, an overarching head fix that? Yes, to some degree, but we've already seen Feige struggle when the shift to Disney Plus happened under Chapek, and he was stretched way too thin. Star Wars is is a behemoth. It just doesn't necessarily have live action every single year, but animation's so important, books are so important. Having someone who's gonna, kinda pluck from each, connect each, no, that seems a little too much, but like Liam was saying, architect for eras. That way, like, like, if there are people more in charge of a specific medium, like books or stuff, at least you're like, "Okay, I'm only gonna ask you questions during this 100-year period. How would this help shape this TV show we're making or movie and stuff like that?" Keep it contained, it's doable. Now, how would they interact with each other? Who's in charge of them? That's a whole other question. I think that kinda comes down to more of, like, does it make sense practically as a business to have paying all these different people for different periods that might not have the same amount of money going their direction and all that? I don't know, and I think that's what's making it such a hard thing right now for Disney with not just Star Wars, but Marvel. Like, Feige has a lot of benefit of the doubt, but he still has to make sure that saving Brave New World, Daredevil, after it got reworked too, with new showrunners, then into Thunderbolts, which is gonna lose money, and is a bunch of, like, 2021 Disney Plus characters. Fantastic Four, which has never been truly a critical darling, hasn't made too much money before in its other live action adaptations, leading into Doomsday, like, he did it once, sure, but when things were simpler, when it was just movies, when it was all linear, and Phase 3, besides Captain Marvel, was just lined up stack as after stack after stack, right? So, it was a much simpler equation. What you got with Star Wars was never simple. George Lucas didn't even bother with the equation. He was just like, "Yeah, have free range. These are your characters. When I come back around to Star Wars, I'll make some changes." And he did. When we look at stuff like Clone Wars from '03 and that initiative with the animated stuff and all the books that kinda came out after Attack of the Clones leading up to Revenge of the Sith, none of that multimedia initiative lines up well at all by 2008 Clone Wars, right? Leland Shee and all these big gatekeepers of the chronology and all that were like, "We're gonna try to make it unified at some point." But even they were, like, at a loss of words. Like, how do we take what George and Filoni did with all these other great creatives who George kinda said, like, "Hey, this I want you to make the story for this," and now you're like, "Oh, not really," right? So, entire books with characters that were alive but then they're killed in 2008 Clone Wars. It's a huge issue when you've got something that's got this many layers of entertainment and mediums in a way that the MCU never really had. So, yes, I'd love to say that we could have 5 Kevin Feiges for Star Wars, right? But that's just it's such an impractical thing, and it's already a miracle that the MCU, after this many years, still has a Kevin Feige that's, fairly successful, all things considered.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is impractical, but it's something that if you were tackling a specific time period, you hire based on what you're working on, right? And maybe the real answer is don't bite off more than you can chew. If the New Republic is your era right now, focus on the New Republic, make Filoni and Favreau, make Favreau in charge of the New Republic era, make Filoni, because he's CCO, the person who reports to the CEO president, which is right now Kathleen Kennedy, will be somebody different in the next year or two. Have that bridge because he knows the New Republic era well, but he also knows all the eras of Star Wars pretty well. And they have that working relationship. I think that would work pretty well, and I mean, that's kinda how they've been operating in general, right? We just haven't seen it put into action yet. So and it's also interesting to see how Dave Filoni works on Ahsoka while also being CCO because really, I know Dave Filoni loves doing creative pursuits, but it really probably is in the best interest of Star Wars and of him to step back and now be more of an active producer on things rather than writing everything and directing everything. I wouldn't want to lose him writing for Star Wars because I do enjoy all his ideas, but at some point, if he's going to be truly a CCO, he's got to oversee everything Star Wars is doing. So that's another question. Unless they decide we're just working on New Republic only, and that's where our focus is, and then we're going to have somebody else kind of art as the architect, whether it's Simon Kinberg or whoever, as the architect of the post Rise of Skywalker part of the Star Wars timeline. They can kind of do that, but I wouldn't bite off more than you can chew right now. And then eventually, when you get to Old Republic, it should really be one person seeing the whole thing through. The other thing they could use really is a division between film and TV. And Marvel used to have this, and Marvel made better TV shows when they had this, even though Ike Perlmutter and that side of Marvel was it was a weird setup because they were almost two completely different companies because Marvel Studios was born out of Marvel struggling to make ends meet. And then once they sold off all their film rights to different companies in order to get out of bankruptcy, and they finally got a little bit of money back from those movies, from their brands being popular again. And then they took the venture of Marvel Studios and made a subsidiary of their company, right? And so Marvel TV was still more affiliated with the Marvel company than Marvel Studios was at the time, where it was almost its own little thing, existing in Hollywood versus existing in New York. It was a big change. And so there was a lot of clashing and division there. But instead of hiring out of that mold, and leaving room for division, what you could do is say, okay, we've worked with this person and we think they are good enough to be in charge of Star Wars TV. Now we got this person in charge of Star Wars film. And then you have president who's in charge of everything. And that's what pretty much every movie studio has. And it's kind of weird Lucasfilm has never had that, because even if you look at the MCU, yes, Kevin Feige is the president of the studio. He's in charge of everything, but he has Louis D'Esposito and somebody else. I'm blanking on their name. Who they're producers on everything. Man, I'm blanking on her name. She's one of the producers on everything. But like, they have the same people who are basically in that same position. They also help him run everything, and then they have one of the things they've been lacking is that person for TV. They just haven't had that person for TV, and most of the people in at Marvel Studios are film people, and they haven't worked on TV. And so I think when you have that division in within the company, it definitely helps things run more smoothly because you have active people involved on different sides. Like Walt Disney Studios as a company has always had a TV side, a film side, an animation side. It's not all one group of people. And so even though Star Wars is all one property, they produce so much content that it makes more sense to have multiple people in charge of multiple different things, and then one person who's in charge of everything, over or not maybe overseeing actively everything, but making sure everything's on the right track. And so they need a Kevin Feige in that sense, but they don't need a Kevin Feige in the sense that they need somebody dictating story to everyone. They can still have story grow organically from different ideas, but you need people creating a cohesive vision for the studio itself. And I think that's one of the big things that they definitely need moving forward. I think they're kind of shifting that way with the way Favreau is now moving back into film, with the way Filoni has kind of been the one focused on TV now, which is where he was, born out of. Favreau has always been a film guy. Filoni's always been a TV guy, whether it was Avatar, or Clone Wars, or Rebels, or now Ahsoka. I think it's good to have that division of labor because it helps people actually get to focus on the thing they want to and not just be spread thin throughout everything. So that's another way they can definitely tackle it. Jerome also says, also, I don't know how Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four are going to have enough time to set up everything for Avengers, considering Fantastic Four is going to take place in another universe too. That'll be really interesting too. This is shifting gears, obviously, but that'll be really interesting. I know I don't want to spoil what the like leaked supposedly in credit scene of the last of the test screenings has been for some people. But it's both like cool and a little underwhelming. So I don't know. I doubt it's real because I don't know why you would show a post credit scene in a test screening. But there's a lot of ways that they can do it. I mean, I guess when you look at the other MCU movies leading into Infinity War specifically, not too many of them directly set up Infinity War. They tackled the Infinity Gems issue in each one. So they had like build up and lead in into the concepts that were going to be in Infinity War, but it wasn't like we ever had like a direct prequel. Like, yes, this movie is directly responsible for Infinity War. Infinity War really created the story out of the threads that had been set up. Now, I'm with you, Jerome, that there have been no threads set up. There's been nothing, no consistency, no continuity across the MCU in the last 5 years. So there's not much to see like, okay, they're going to pull from here or they're going to pull from there. But I think the way Fantastic Four can set it up is just purely having connection to Doctor Doom and maybe this version of Doctor Doom being born out of their universe and going into our main 616 universe. And then that initial confrontation between heroes and villains is the last thing we see before we get into Avengers Doomsday, is that the Fantastic Four are at odds with this Doctor Doom. I think that's the main thing you can really set up, but I don't see Fantastic Four being a movie that's going to end with like a specific direct like build-in cliffhanger to Avengers Doomsday just because I the MCU's never really done that. But you're right, it needs it kind of more than ever because there's really no direction at all for anything to follow. And I think that's going to be the underwhelming thing around Doomsday and Secret Wars just in general is that it can pull all these other things in and it can be amazing storytelling, but really in the long run it's not going to feel as much like an event as the last few Avengers movies have because we had 10 years of build in and like teasing and anticipation and little threads pulled around. Doomsday is going to be its own unique story. So we will see how it goes, but I don't think Fantastic Four is truly going to set it up and like that it ends with like the opening scene of Doomsday at the end of Fantastic Four or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can really add to that is it's nice to see Brave New World and Thunderbolts really try to talk in concert with their post-credit scenes. It's nice to finally have plot-driven post-credit scenes after like stuff like Eternals and stuff like Thor: Love and Thunder, just like throwing out random stuff. Like that's great. When are we gonna get to any of that, right? Like, and Eternals, for all intents and purposes, is gone. I mean, it kinda was like that in the comics too. The Eternals don't really function the same way as the rest of the heroes do, so I don't mind it, but, there's just some choices that just never made sense. Like, I look at Phase 4 now as like the fallout, all the pieces kind of, like, being laid to rest after everything that happens in Endgame, right? You're like, "Okay, here's some cool stories, the blah, 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 here's some new introductions, fine." I think everybody was like the way they were talking about Ant-Man 3, they're like, "Okay, phase 5 is really when this is all gonna start getting kicked off and all that." Gonna be some pieces before, but 5 is really what's gonna happen. And it just wasn't great. Like, I liked Kang. I think Jonathan Majors actually did quite a great job with him. It's just it's very underwhelming when Kang the Conqueror, that version, is just kind of beaten by Ant-Man and in his own world essentially, or in a world that he knows more the limitations, has all the technological, sleight of hands over him. And yeah, some cool action, don't get me wrong, but it was just a very mediocre CGI fest, and he loses, and Ant-Man gets to go home, everybody gets home. There's no loss in that film, right? You could have set the stakes with him, kinda like how you did in confusing, but almost, like, more unsettling than anything ending of Loki season 1 once you, what did it kill that version of Kang, I'm blanking on his name, what did he call himself?
Oh,
Uh,
God,
it's a great
the
name, but I'm blanking.
yeah, I'm
Uh
blanking on it too.
But yeah,
Um,
but the version that he plays in Loki, right? Like the one that's like, "You kill me, that changes everything." Like the whole all of them are gonna start coming for you, right? If we had Kang kinda do his thing and then actually make a huge dent on, at this point, a pretty high level, Avenger, yeah, you would've been like, "Okay, great. There's some near to propulsion even if Kang doesn't show up." That doesn't happen, and then obviously Jonathan Majors has all his legal issues and problems. Yeah, so you've gotta readjust everything now, you're switching to Doom, who is a character I think no matter what will always be better. I still think Kang has a place to be to, like, kinda fill in, like, a Beyonder role for Secret Wars. Will it happen? Probably not, right? Unless they have some fantastic recast coming that we just don't know about yet. But yeah, I mean, there is no real narrative threads other than these post-credit scenes, and you could argue Thunderbolt should have been Bucky really leading that team, not just being a supporting character, and then why is him and Sam kinda split up after all their great chemistry and Falcon and the Winter Soldier, right? Why not more scenes in his film? Maybe Sam Wilson make an appearance there, right? If you're gonna basically restart these last few films should have a couple of reshot scenes, even if they don't look perfect, just to get some connections, and it's a little bit more direct, it's a little bit more concrete, it's a little less tasteful, but when you're this long into this big of a franchise, you have to do what you have to do to get everything back on track. So now we're in this position where Doomsday, I think, will be good. I'm not actually super worried about Doomsday. I like the energy that everyone's been having. It seems like there is some big plan for the Russos, and everything I'm seeing from Downey looks like he's really committed to the part. But it feels like it's almost like we're coming into Age of Ultron with way more crazier pieces, and this is just gonna be something that will we really know anything about it? I don't know. I don't know if we'll see anything cool come out of it. And then from there, you have Brave New Day for Spider-Man, which is under Sony. How much is gonna that be connected? Will that be used as narrative tissue or just, like, almost like just getting him into the grander narrative and then everything going on with Secret Wars, which, has great comics to lean off of, but how long can it be? How many characters can you put there? It's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough, and, I'm grateful that Star Wars never really has run into that issue, like, they can do all the MCUification they want from Mandoverse, but they've never really had that issue where it's like, "Here we put in 50 characters, and how do we make it work?"
Right. Exactly. And I mean, I think they would be best to avoid that. As Star Wars can use event movies, it can be beneficial. Clean mess with things. Gonna do a sequel trilogy, right? The Rise of Skywalker should have been that kind of thing, that end game, and they kind of tried to build some elements of that in there, but they didn't deliver on it. And so that's what they really should be looking at moving forward is how do we glean the best things about the excitement and anticipation levels of the MCU and bring that into Star Wars, but not necessarily the way it's plotted. I don't think the plotting is necessarily one to one. But thanks for that question, Jerome. It definitely led to some fun conversation here. We want to get back to you guys' chats as well. We want to run through our second story here real quick, and then the rest of the stream will be pretty much completely devoted for chat. So again, send in your questions, your comments, your theories, anything you'd like to discuss, anything you'd like to mention about any topic. Doesn't have to be Star Wars related. Can be MCU, can be DC. We talk about superheroes a lot on these streams. It can be about any specific TV show or film or anything you'd like to discuss, anything you'd like to mention, let us know in the chat. It is first come, first serve. Super chat bumps you up to the top of the queue. Obviously, chats pertaining to our specific topic we're talking about at that time will also bump you up. And then if you are a member of the Patreon or YouTube membership programs at a certain tier, you will also have priority chat access. All right, let's get into the Respawn story. So this was a story coming out basically, excuse me, the first week of Andor, right after Celebration. We covered Zero Company and kind of the bright future around Star Wars video games, the fact that Respawn was still working on Jedi 3, and there was a lot of excitement and anticipation around that. Then it came out a week later that they had massive layoffs, laying off somewhere in the rumored 200 to 300 people from the company. And we've since learned about different games that have been canceled because of that. We've had the cancellation of the Black Panther game, as well as some others throughout the last few weeks. And so they released a statement a month ago, and this is kind of old news again, but we'll get to the new part. uh, is that they are focusing on Apex and they're focusing on Jedi 3, which was a good thing for us as fans of the Jedi games, that that's still in the cards. They're still fully planning and committing to doing that. But recently, there have been rumors about even more layoffs within the company, and morale is hitting an all-time low. People are talking about it within the company itself. People are very frustrated. They're taking to social media, talking about the state of Respawn and when they can get this Jedi game out. The rumored release date has been 2027, which would follow the same pattern of the Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor releases, where you got 2019 for Fallen Order and 2023 for Survivor. So a 4-year gap. It would make sense that 27 was the next game for Jedi 3, although I was kind of hoping it would be earlier, considering one of the reasons it took so long between Fallen Order and Survivor was they didn't expect to get a sequel after Fallen Order. They didn't know if they were going to get a sequel. They weren't greenlit for a sequel. And I would imagine when Survivor came out, they were like, yes, we're going to do at least 3 games and tell a trilogy of stories, because they knew it would be a success after the success of Fallen Order. So I'd imagine they were a little further along on the Survivor sequel than they were on the Fallen Order sequel when those games came out. But now we kind of are up in the air with Respawn really downsizing, with morale at an all-time low, as Patrick Wren, the senior encounter designer at Respawn, says on Twitter. it's kind of interesting to see how this all shakes out. It's a really sad story. I mean, the video game industry has been hit so hard this year with layoffs and people losing their job. And it went from similar, it's very similar to streaming, where it went from this like bulletproof industry, this bulletproof career trajectory for a lot of people in 2020 in the bubble when people were playing video games because they had nothing else to do. They were hyper focused on video games and games that might have been smaller, not gotten a shot when it wasn't the pandemic, got a shot and were really beloved and took off during the COVID times. And then that created, even more escalation for more games. And then as since, people have been a little bit more selective with what they're buying. It doesn't help that everything's gone up with inflation. I mean, the fact that we're climbing, I mean, this Switch 2 comes out tomorrow for some people, Thursday for East Coast, um, tomorrow for West Coast, but doesn't help that now games have gone up $20 on their base price in 5 years. People are just a little more selective with video games, and so everything is kind of changing for that landscape. And I think with that, with the downsizing of Respawn, even though they say they're focusing on Jedi 3 as one of their main, basically their main game, that's not something that's continually running like Apex. Um, I still don't necessarily buy that we're getting 2027 for Jedi 3. I think it's a great idea. It would be really nice, but also I mentioned last week when we talked about Battlefront 3, with the changing landscape around video games, not just with prices and stuff like that, but the fact that 2027 very well could be one of the last years of the PS5 Xbox Series. It could be a year, next year could be the year we hear about PS6. 2027 could be the year we hear about PS6. What does the gaming landscape look like around that time with digital games, with PC gaming? What does Xbox do? Because they've been struggling recently. All of that's really up into the air. So I think it's interesting if you look at the 2027 release date, that might be a release they want to push back if they want to be one of the premier games on whatever the next gen of consoles is for PlayStation 6, or if Xbox continues with their consoles here into the future. So Sonic, when you hear all this, it is a sad story, but do you think Jedi Survivor sequel, Jedi 3, still has a shot for 2027, or do you think it's gonna be pushed off into the future?
No shot at all. I mean, even before all of this, we heard that the game director of the first 2 Jedi games is out. So, once you don't have, like, your creative visionary, the one that, like, has had the trust of the team for probably at that point, like, closer to 10 years, if anything, right, with the development leading into Fallen Order. Yeah, there was always gonna be delay. I thought maybe it'd be, like, a year delay. Now this might be closer to 2, ho hopefully 2, but maybe even 3, like, it sucks because not only did Survivor do well, like, despite all the bugs and everything at launch, like, people consider it a nice step up. Maybe not in terms of story, but in terms of a game and with structure and progression of Cal Kestis and doing something a little different than, like, a little bit more of a generic story, like the first game has. It's like, alright, like, where everyone's raring the goat, right? There's so many memes about, like, the Turgle still gets, like, huge memes because he's just a funky looking dude, right? Like, and you're like, "What is he gonna destroy now?" and all that, but that's the thing, that's people really love Survivor. It was so immersive by not being a true open world game, right? People still talk about it more than they do Outlaws, which just had another DLC come out, right? And yes, I will be doing walkthroughs of that on the channel here pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, it sucks, but it's like you said, the industry has been cut up to death. I wouldn't be surprised if there's also issues going on with, like, making the story be bigger, but now we've got issues like AI voice acting over regular voice actors and the unions behind that and all. There's just so many different things happening right now that is just coming down to just, like, some of it just, capitalism, like, profits, people want more and more every year. Some of it is, like, the changing landscape of technology, the type of work that's being offered, the type of work that can be automated, the type of work that's gonna be removed, and then 2, 3 years from now, they're gonna be like, "Oh my god, we need to hire these people back for less pay because we can't do that same stuff yet with AI." Like, it's a mess. It's a mess, and not just in video games, but like you said, in streaming and in any tech-based industry right now. So, I think Jedi 3 is gonna happen. I'm worried about its quality now because of all the delays, because everything happening at Respawn. The internal memos about, like, there's no way we're gonna do Battlefront 3 even if people are super hyped about it, even if this is that it's, like, all-time high peaks for gameplay and all that, right? It sucks. It absolutely sucks. I'm hoping for the best. I just wanted to end well for Cal, so that way if, if and, if this compromises, like, maybe it's not the best game, but he gets to make, like, a leapfrog into, like, Mandoverse or Dre's New Jedi Order, fine, right? But ideally, a character that's introduced in a medium, I'd like them to be defined by that medium. We've already seen some struggles with Disney Plus with, like, stuff like Ahsoka from animation jumping in, and she's so much more established. So, yeah, I'd like his story to be fully completed, and then whatever else we get past that is gonna just be a bonus, right? So, we'll see. I am really hoping for the best, but I don't see 2027 happening. I think it's gonna be closer to 2029, if anything. I Yeah, I mean, let's just see how these latest games kinda kick off and go from here, right? The pricing is gonna be a huge thing. I don't know if Zero Company is gonna be priced at 80. I think this is gonna be, like, priced closer to, like, how Squadrons was priced at a bit more of a discount, but I guess a discount now would be $60. So, we'll see, we'll see. I think we're running into 2 different timelines where, like, now that Lucasfilm Games is a lot more integrated, now that EA's exclusivity is really fully wearing off, and Respawn is basically the last remnant of EA with Star Wars. We'll see how these other developers pick it up, and if that goes well, I wouldn't be surprised if the pressure is on EA to be like, "No, no, we have to put all our resources in this. We don't care about Battlefield right now. Battlefield's actually on the back burner." Right? Like, that I'd like for once EA to be like, "Alright, here's our obligation to this massive franchise for." The way they were talking about Fallen Order, like, "Yeah, we're not gonna really sell a lot this, holiday season," and they outsold expectations for Fallen Order by, like, 2, 3 million, and they were shocked by it. They put out their own estimates so publicly, and they're like, "Yeah, single player games. Nobody really wants that. They want a live service game." And then people bought the game, and they're like, "Oh, wow, what a great success," right? So they have not done anything right for these Jedi games. Frankly, only Survivor maybe got some of that, but they also still rushed the timeline of that, only pushed it back, like, a little bit here and there for bug fixes and all that before going gold. But they haven't really treated it super well as a franchise, despite it being critically acclaimed, despite it being such a good mover and and everything. So, I'm fearing that this is gonna be like another classic example of EA just meddling and delaying and doing all these things that it's gonna be a little bit more of a lackluster 3rd game. But, I'm gonna hope for the best. I think the pressure from other studios, as long as they deliver good stories, stuff that's Outlaws level and above, I think that puts pressure on them no matter what to keep the level of this final 3rd Jedi game. But after that, I don't expect to see EA for, like, another 10 years around Star Wars.
Yeah, I expect the game to be good. I'm worried about the story a little bit,
Yeah.
especially like you said, losing the creative in charge. I'm worried that the story isn't clear and the story doesn't naturally continue off of where they were, especially if if it does come out 28, 29, 30, 7, 6, 5 years after the last one, like, where do you take the story? How does it naturally build? How does it naturally flow? I think that's a big thing that they've gotta look into because it's gonna be difficult to keep that cohesion for that many years. Now, the gameplay, I'm not as worried about because they can just copy and paste pretty much everything from Survivor and add a few tweaks to improve it. I think one of the things I'm, kind of mixed in terms of how worried I am about it is how ambitious the game is. We talked a lot about with Survivor, everybody really loved a lot of the open world elements of Survivor that a few of the planets had, and like the side quests and the stuff to do post game. There was a lot of fun extra stuff in Survivor that Fallen Order lacked. Like Fallen Order had collectibles, but it didn't have side quests. And so it was nice to have post game for Survivor, or things you could do if you wanted to pad out finishing the main campaign. You could pad out it with side stories and the bounty hunts and all that type of stuff that was really, really fun. And it achieved, even in a small way, that open world, I think, better than Outlaws did in what it went for. It was definitely a much smaller scale than what Outlaws did, but it really, really succeeded with what it tried. And so I think a lot of us are hoping Sir Jedi 3 is truly open world, or at least has 3 or 4 planets you can explore besides just one. You know, there can add a lot of levels to it. So if you're cutting back, if they rush it, it's probably going to lose ambition and the story might be weaker. If you let it go for too long, then it gets into the concern about, do people still have interest? Do they still play this? How do we keep that fervor from Survivor into Jedi 3? I think that'll be their biggest hurdle for delaying, but video games um, hardly ever meet their release date and hardly ever have problems from delaying. They usually only get better. Now there have been more games recently that, constantly get delayed and still stink, but in the long history of games, there have been plenty of games that have been delayed for 10 years and come out and are incredible. And it was worth the delays because they're still really great. I mean, and we're looking at one of the longest delays here coming out in the next few years with Metroid Prime 4. BioShock Infinite, one of my favorite games ever, was delayed for a very long time. So there are a lot of examples of good delays for games, but there are also examples of bad ones. And I think because of internal struggles, rather than just not being able to figure out the story, that's a little bit more concerning. But hopefully, because they have reiterated multiple times that their focus is Jedi 3, hopefully the people who are still there find something to rally around in that game and their pride around their product that they're working on. I'm sure it's very difficult over there right now, but if there's any solace out there, hopefully it is in the work that you're bringing joy to so many people with these games, and that you can continue to do so in developing the third Jedi game. So, looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that story, and hopefully a lot of these people who have lost their jobs are able to find, something here in the future that can also bring them some joy in the video game space. But yeah, Kylie Stewart's son asked, when is the third Jedi game coming out? We don't know yet. It's rumored for 27, but it sounds like most likely we'll get an update that is not correct. But they won't announce that until probably late 26, early 27. And I think we won't get, if we get a reveal date, not a reveal date, if we get a reveal trailer in the next year and a half, that's a pretty good sign. I think you can get the game. If you get a reveal trailer by the end of 2026, you'll probably be looking at 2028. If nothing comes until 2027, then you're not going to obviously get the game for 2029 or 2030. So, yeah, it is a scary time for that game, but hopefully it comes out at some point. So turning back to the chat again, everybody, we're an hour in our stream. We have an hour to go. So the chat is the main way we run these streams. We love to have you guys ask us anything you want. We want to have some conversation and some fun with you, even a little bit of an incentive to ask a really great question is sometimes we clip these out for videos, so you could be the star of a video if you ask a really great question. So send something in, send anything you've wanted to know about us, about our thoughts on film, on superheroes, pop culture, Star Wars, whatever it is. Send it into the chat and we will get to it. Again, it is first come, first serve, but Super Chat bumps you up to the top and it supports the show, so we greatly appreciate that. If you are a member of Patreon or YouTube memberships at a certain tier, you do get priority chat access as well. All right, turning back to the chat. Critical Thinker says, I think Star Wars definitely needs a clearer direction and greater consistency, which is something I hear Marvel has also been struggling with right now. Yes, it has been. It's been struggling since 2021, really. Every year we get that thing from Marvel that people are like, this is it, this is going to end the streak, and then the next thing comes out and it's kind of underwhelming. But if Fantastic Four hits, that might be their best stretch in years in terms of like consecutive releases being good. So hopefully hopefully Fantastic Four is good. But yeah, Star Wars definitely needs greater consistency. I completely agree with you on that. Well, both greater direction, clearer direction, and greater consistency. They need to choose what they want to focus their resources on. If they don't do, like I said earlier, and hire out for like having a TV studio head, an animation head, a film head, if they didn't want to do those sub studio heads underneath the president of the company, then they need to kind of just pick something and run with it and tell that story until it's over. And if that's the New Republic era, then they do so. And if somebody comes in for a creator-driven story like maybe Sean Levy or Tony Gilroy or whoever, and they're like, "Hey, I have this idea and I'll be the one in charge of it and I'll, do everything." Then you can still greenlight those projects, and that's something I think a lot of fans have been underwhelmed with Marvel, and we've kind of been saved from the tedium of the MCU in some ways via, like, the Spider-Verse films from Sony or when Fox still had X-Men, because there were things that were different that were kind of coming out at the same time, still embracing the Marvel properties, but telling stories that the MCU won't tell. I think that's one of the positive directions that the DC is looking at doing is they're not completely getting rid of Elseworld style storytelling. And in Star Wars, it wouldn't be Elseworlds; it would be in the same timeline. But you can still have room for doing side projects when you're focused on your main one. You just should have a focus on your main one, and not have 50 things going on with 50 different creators all doing different things and trying to keep everything together. I think it's obviously a format that shows that it doesn't necessarily work, or it has inconsistent quality. So if they are able to say New Republic's our time, we're going to hyper focus on that. We're going to tell those stories. We're going to do Thrawn. We're going to do Mandalorian and Grogu. We're going to create new conflicts. We're going to really build on that. And then when that story's over, hopefully it seamlessly transitions into whatever Simon Kinberg's working on with the post Rise of Skywalker stuff and the Rey New Jedi Order movie. And then that's going to be our focus. And yeah, if somebody comes along like a Tony Gilroy and says, I want to tell this story about this random character in this period, and this is the way I want to write it, and it's going to be 2 seasons, and it's going to be done exactly like this, then sure, if it's all really tight and neat, you can greenlight those side projects, but don't spread yourself too thin. So I agree with you on a lot of those uh, points, critical thinker. I think it's consistency overall that will improve the Star Wars brand. It doesn't necessarily matter what they do or what their stories are about. They just need a consecutive string of things that are at least 7 out of 10s, and then people will start getting happy because the MCU kind of made a career or made a universe on 7 out of 10s. Most of those movies were not incredible when the MCU was in their peak, but they were all good. They were all entertaining and they were all fun. And so I think that's what Star Wars needs to do is have if 4 of their 5 movies are really entertaining and the fifth one is incredible, then people will be satisfied. But if you make 3 that are mediocre, 1 that's awful, and 1 that's incredible, obviously nobody's going to be happy with that.
Yeah, yeah, and to add to that point, critical thinker, it is like how we were discussing. It's just there's so many more eras that are always open with Star Wars. So consistency and projects, yes, that'll be great. But I mean, even when Disney started, people were looking at Rogue One. They're like, "Is this a sequel to The Force Awakens?" And that's with the iconic image of the Death Star with Tarkin, like with people that
Vader.
is are in the original Star Wars, and people still got confused, right? So I think Star Wars will always have more of a challenge in the MCU because, again, like Liam said, it's not very linear with its storytelling. But yeah, like consistency is gonna be important. Just like make sure we're making TV shows with TV showrunners and all that. I think Star Wars has been a little bit better about that, even if it hasn't really had the best execution. The MCU just straight up was not using showrunners for a while. For the first couple, it was like they had it, but not in the same way that's in a traditional TV sense. And Star Wars kind of was like that, but like again, it was Favreau's first TV show in The Mandalorian, right? That's an insane thing to do when you're been in film for so long as an actor, as a producer, as a director. He pulled it off for season 1 and season 2, but he had help with Filoni to bridge all the little gaps that he didn't understand about Star Wars, about the canon, about how people are interacting with all this different mediums and, like, what they would anticipate coming into the first live action TV show, right? So yes, consistency is the name of the game, but like we were talking about before, we need era runners of sorts, or at least people divided into that. And priorities. Like, okay, like if we have time to do both, great. But if we have to do select something to have released this year, what's gonna come out first? I'd say Mandoverse, right? Like finish all that stuff up, establish it, get the recast out of the way for the original trilogy heroes. Move into that now and just embrace it for the next 3, 4 years, and yeah, people will be whining about everything online. That's just how Star Wars fans are, right? But if you complete this little MCU that's in Star Wars with these 7 out of 10 and up projects, and you reach a nice conclusion, that movie's coming out, and then you hear about all these other eras starting up, naturally your interest starts going there because you're like, "Wow, look what they did to, like, really get this back half super strong," right? This is what like, it was consecutive, there were little pieces connecting to it, it felt like peak Marvel in a lot of ways, but with Star Wars, bam, great, sweet. Now I'm excited for another High Republic thing, or maybe jumping into the Old Republic, or into post Episode 9, New Jedi Order. Even if you don't ultimately feel satisfied with projects, it's just the fact that you've seen a project be completed with the right tools, with the right people, with good consistency that it opens up your eyes to, like, I'm gonna give it a shot. As it is right now with more of these creative driven stuff from Leslie Headland, from Tony Gilroy and all that, that's wonderful. That worked when Star Wars was just movies, right, and an animated TV show here and there. Now that it's expanded and has way more money to play around with, even with the streaming bubble burst, yeah, it's learning how to, like, are we treating everything like canon, or are we treating it like different tiers of canon like we did in the early 2000s where we got George Lucas canon, television canon, all this and that, and that's kinda what we already kinda shifted to. A lot of, like, people like Filoni, what's his name? Pablo Hidalgo, right? They're talking about, like, "Oh, canon? There is a canon, but what you're seeing is a translation of canon in different mediums and all that," and we've kind of always known that, but okay, if you're gonna do this translation, make it good, make it consistent, make it strong, make it so that the people who are gonna be engaging with that and bounce into the next project who are completionists understand that, like, not everything is gonna be at the same quality per se or same dialogue or whatever, but because they're seeing, like, you're consistently trying to hit the right points, same level of, like, this is good Star Wars regardless of the medium, then every other era opens up and you can kinda go back to kind of freewheeling just with a little bit more structure.
And it's again another reason why I feel like the term Star Wars canon really should kind of go away at some point in the next few years, and it really should be like renamed something else that focuses on the fact that it's this specific timeline, right? You can have other stories that get bumped down in the new canon tier system because we are now kind of going back to that with film and TV being the top, and then comics and books and stuff being lower because we saw Andor do our first like true complete retcon. But I think it would be beneficial, and again, going back to this idea that I brought up a year ago of the fact that you could run Legends again and have it be timeline B, and you have timeline A and timeline B, and they're not going to make movies, or at least now, we're not going to make movies in this timeline, but it's a literature based timeline. Then you have the film and TV based timeline. Like, yeah, it could confuse some people, but I think if you're already hardcore enough to be invested in books, you're not going to be that confused by it. And then if you kept it that way, maybe it runs as a book based medium until it gets really popular. And then they're like, hey, you know what? We haven't tried this. Maybe let's just try it and see how it goes. Let's make a movie in this Legends timeline. And then, whoa, it really blew up. People love it. Let's make another one. They could do that. And I think it goes to show that what we've always said, people get upset because Legends isn't part of the canon anymore, like it was, in the past, but still it's still its own timeline that exists, and it still is being added to with the Old Republic, not very often, but it is being added to. If they just brought it back and added more material, I think that would elevate the idea of two consistent timelines, two different timelines. So I don't know. It's something I still want them to do. It would be really nice if they could figure out a way to run these two things as like Star Wars has multiple timelines and multiple places. You wouldn't just have canon, non-canon legends, because we got Ninth Jedi show coming out, right? Does that exist into canon, or is it non-canon? How do you explain that around people? Do you have like an anime universe of Star Wars, right? You can do so many different things. There's no really caps on it, and therefore you can like kind of leave certain pieces closer to the original intent from like the George Lucas purists out there versus the people who want more and different, interesting, varied universes and styles, right? So there can be a little bit of both. There can be room for everything if they wanted to try that. Jerome says we need to get James Gunn to direct Star Wars 2. Maybe. I don't know. I think he could do it. I'm sure he has some love for Star Wars, but he is very busy right now with this DC universe, so, it won't be any time in the next 10 years, I can guarantee you that. Probably not within the next 20 years too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love that. I think, like we were talking about on the last stream, Guardians 3 proves you can do a little bit more of a mature story. There are messy parts to 3, but I think that's more because he didn't get to have a say in how his characters were treated in Infinity War and Endgame, right? And he's complained about that on record. But everything that he's talked about, from how he handles pre-production, storyboarding, what he does with his post-production, and it seemingly he's already applied everything that he's learned from the MCU, what his successes in the MCU, over to how he at least directed and produced the Superman movie that's coming out here pretty soon, right? We'll see. Yeah, I think that's gonna be his first real test, because that's something that's such a hard property. He's a naturally a bit of a cheesy character, right? Like, it's kinda hard to get away from that, but if he nails that, then I think he's gonna nail anything he wants, because he's already proven, like I said, all the mature, darker stuff with Guardians 3. You can balance, light moments and heavy moments, and then you got a Star Wars film there, because that's the same thing with Star Wars. There's plenty of humor, right? And, it depends on what humor you like, obviously, but Star Wars handles pretty mature themes. I mean, the original trilogy is literally about fascism, right? Like, it just is, right? It's not just your hero's journey and all that. It's literally about the destruction of fascism, with heroes that are modeled by George Lucas, as he said it, Viet Cong, and the Empire being the American military industrial complex. Like, it's already always been a heavy political story from the start, so it wouldn't be shocking for me to see Gunn kinda handle that with how he's been able to handle character stuff and franchise stuff and overarching plot lines, and adjust his own stories when things kinda don't go his way. I think Star Wars would be something that he might not love a little bit more of the restrictions of, but if he gets to kinda do his little own pocket universe, maybe, like, one film and hand it off to somebody else, and it just kinda stays there. Oh, yeah, I think he could be a great fit, but you don't get become a studio head for no reason if you think, "Ah, yeah, I've got a couple films in me, and then I'll head over." No, you're in it for the long run.
Yeah, he's definitely gonna take a step away from active writing and directing here after Superman. I think, it's one thing to be heavily involved with one project when it's the only one your studio's really working on, and now once they open it up next year, we're gonna have so many things coming out, so many things going on at the same time. He's not really gonna have that ability. Now, he be the type of person who, like, comes in for Justice League and is like, "I wanna be the one who writes and directs Justice League." I could see that for, like, really seminal films for them. I would
Yeah.
prefer that he didn't. I like the idea of him overseeing everything, but I could see him wanting to do that. But yeah, I don't think Star Wars is in the cards really anytime soon. Critical Thinker says, finished the audiobook for Darth Bane Rule of Two. Overall, good book. Xana was well developed. Karpyshyn is good at showing the process of how people are drawn into the dark side ideology. Also liked how the book tied in with the events of the Jedi versus Sith comic and the Kevin J. Anderson Bane of the Sith short story. Yeah, I love pretty much everything you said. I like all of the tie-ins, and I just love how Carpathian took what was kind of a cheesy story and, birthed out of late 90s, early 2000s comics and elevated it in pretty much every way and made it this sadistic, dark, twisted story. And I think it's great. I think the things that pull Rule of Two down are its connections to the past and trying to honor and keep those stories kind of in line with what he's telling in his darker style, but it's just brilliant. It works so well. And I love Santa. Santa's so good in those books. And I love how she comes into her own at the end of that book. And she's great in the third one. So hopefully you enjoy the third one as well.
Yeah, nothing I can add there other than it's cool to see the comic version kinda turn into something much richer, right? But people still will use a lot of that comic art because, it's a thought bomb. How do you exactly visualize that in your head? Go to the comic.
Exactly. And it's kind of some of our only images for a lot of those characters. Like it's our only like official
Yeah.
images for a lot of the side characters in that story. Like for Fala being a half like a satyr, like half
Yeah.
goat. It's
Yeah.
kind of weird, but I guess they had to stick with it. Um, let's see. Brandon Tran says, "Don't know if you guys have covered this topic yet, but did you talk about the AI Darth Vader talking like Chat GPT in the Fortnite update?" We actually haven't covered it. I did have it open in my tabs as one of the stories that we have yet to cover. So we can talk about it right now if you want. But yeah, there's been I mean, obviously a lot of controversy over it. People were filming, Darth Vader swearing and stuff in Fortnite, and just in general, it's definitely odd. With especially in Hollywood, with so many things around AI, it's been such a controversial issue for the last year and a half. To hear some of the ways that AI Vader has talked, and just pairing that with the fact that James Earl Jones just passed away. This is really our first big Vader voice, if I can recall, that we have heard since he passed away. And so, yeah, it's definitely odd, but I don't really play Fortnite, so I don't really have any firsthand experience with it. If you play from Brandon, I'd love to hear your experience with the actual version that you've played as, but I haven't. I haven't experienced it directly outside of seeing all the videos on social media.
Yeah, no, same here. I haven't played Fortnite in years, but I definitely had friends who sent it to me, and it would just be like, "What's like rank the best food, the rest best races, and all that," and you're like, "What?" And then you'd be like, Darth Vader would be like, "I can't do that," but if I had to, he'd be like, "Hispanic," and black. I'm like, "What are you saying?" Like, it's crazy. Like, yeah, I don't think this is what James Earl Jones intended. Like, he was very clearly on record, like, "I want this to be fully AI. Nobody else has my voice but me for the rest of Star Wars history," right? "I want Darth Vader to live beyond me," right? So, he was so open about it in a way that, like, a lot of especially a lot of older Hollywood, and I mean, it's not just older Hollywood, but, like, just, like, as a creative, as an actor, as someone who had such a long-standing career to be like, "No, I want my voice to stick around forever with this character." I don't think he expected this. I don't think he expected Fortnite to be really the first real example of that, of it being fully trained on, like, what people are saying and directing by. But yeah, I found it very concerning that a lot of my friends who aren't big Star Wars fans suddenly were talking about Star Wars with me, and I'm like, "What's going on?" And then I find all these videos they link from, like, Twitter and stuff, and I'm like, "Oh, wow." Like, this is I think it's been tweaked. I haven't heard anything since, but that first couple of days was I was hearing some crazy things. I was definitely hearing some crazy things, and just the idea of James Earl Jones talking like that was appalling to me, but I don't know. Nobody really knew the man. Maybe that's how he talked. Maybe he did the Darth Vader voice for fun in his house just in his last few years, reading menus or just enjoying himself with all his little stories or whatever, right? Like, when you got a voice like that, wouldn't you use it, right? So, I don't know. It's not a big story per se, but it is definitely a very interesting cautionary tale that has some fun moments to it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's created some good memes, and honestly, any press is good press right now in the world of Star Wars, especially after such a big May. Like for a May and June and April where there wasn't really much coming out outside of Andor, right? And that came out within 4 weeks. Star Wars really blew up for the first time in years in a non-negative way. you know, like last year, people were talking about Star Wars in June because there were so many people hating on the Acolyte. But this year, it was positive. It was like a really little like 2015 bubble almost, where we
Yeah,
got like an
yeah.
elite Star Wars thing coming out with Andor. Then you have the resurgence of the films with Revenge of the Sith and the love that was around there in the theaters, and actors like Hayden Christensen getting so much love at Celebration, and just like all the stuff around Celebration and Revenge of the Sith and Andor. It couldn't have been more positive. So I think right now it's like, even if you have this goofy AI Vader and the memes that are coming out with it, and the recordings of him talking and saying really off the cuff stuff, it's still kind of good press for Star Wars,
Yeah,
and that
yeah.
people are enjoying the iconography of Star Wars right now, and in the spirit of like the original group of prequel memes, right? That's kind of what this is birthed out of, is people just enjoying this franchise and all the goofiness and the weirdness that they can get out of it, and that's at least that's the positive to glean out of that for sure. Critical Thinker says, had the sequel trilogy not happened, I think the ideal structure would have been a main narrative centered on recasting original trilogy characters and then having spin-offs in other eras like would have been like we've been having now. Once you're done with the original trilogy characters, then you jump into the future and do new stuff or head back to the old republic or something and make that the next main narrative. And then I know you asked this question down below as well, and so I think we should add this to the conversation. You said if the sequel trilogy had been adapted from the EU, how would you have done it? Would you want Jason and Jaina as twin protagonists against the Vong or something new, a new bad guy, or Jason versus Jaina story? So wrapping all those comments into one, I do think you're right, and that's the ideal way to tackle it, but it was absolutely not the realistic way of tackling it. Just looking back at the time, and again, I say this every time we talk about the sequels or Force Awakens, but looking back at 2015, it's just such a weird era to look back on because it's so completely different from where we are now, just in every single way of Star Wars, right? 2015, you wanted no connections to the prequels whatsoever. I mean, to the point where, like, sometimes in The Force Awakens, or I even remember in Rogue One in 2016, when Bar Gullet came on the screen, people were like mad because they were like, no CGI creatures, no
Yeah.
CGI, all practical. Why are we using CGI? Like literally nothing to do with the prequels. And George Lucas has been on record even saying so. He's been on record saying Disney said, we kind of don't want to do anything to do with the prequels when making these movies because they're so controversial. And I mean, it's understandable. There was no love outside of our age group's little like subculture that eventually became now the main culture of love for the prequels. The people who were running the conversation at the time just did not like the prequels. And so I think when you look at the risks that had to be taken around starting Star Wars for the first time with Disney, I don't think there was really any other direction for them to realistically go than the direction they went. Could they have been a little bit more creative? Yes, and I wish they were in the first film, or I wish they put out The Force Awakens and then waited a year maybe to see what the response was and then constructively built their next film. But instead they had Ryan Johnson working on The Last Jedi while The Force Awakens was shooting. He's writing The Last Jedi, so he's working with the shooting script, and it led to the whole dice problem with like dice are important in his story, but they weren't important in The Force Awakens because they got cut. There were a lot of inconsistencies there. And so, I mean, I think ideally, like I've said in the past, Star Wars, the most iconic part of Star Wars is and always will be the original trilogy, Han, Luke, Leia, Darth Vader. Like I think that's the most iconic part of Star Wars, and even for prequel people like us, we nothing's more iconic than Vader and Luke and Han and Leia. So ideally, yes, you do recast. Ideally, yes, you could embrace the legend stories. Ideally, you could embrace the Vong and tell the Jason and Jaina story. You could go Harry Potter route and like cast teenagers or tweens to play Jason and Jaina and watch them grow up into the Vong conflict over this like long cinematic experience, right? Like that would be awesome. And I've suggested they do that still today and just do it as an offshoot universe, an extra spin-off universe. I think that's still a plausible thing, especially in today's world where people are a little bit more comfortable with recasts. But back in 2015, 2014, usually I would have in a way of like, I think you needed a new conflict. And really like even going back to how I felt in 2015, it wasn't the worst idea in the world, even as a big Legends fan, even as a big book reader. It wasn't the worst idea in the world to say we're doing a new story and a new universe, and like those are its own separate universe. I think the big slap in the face is that they were never continued, right? The stories were just killed off and they never continued the narrative. but it wasn't the worst thing in the world to say, "Those this is a different timeline," because there was just no real room to tell the stories. If you just copied Legends, you would have directly had to jump into something like Legacy of the Force, and that just wouldn't have worked in my opinion, because there's so much build up to Legacy of the Force from the decades of stories in the EU at the time, that there would be no real payoff. Like how, I mean, similarly to how we had in the sequel trilogy itself, right? How do you really get attached to Ben Solo, Kylo Ren, when you only have known him for 3 movies when he's been already turned into the bad guy, right? If you start with like, "Oh, this is Han Solo's son. Oh, he turns into the bad guy. Oh, he's the bad guy now, and oh, now he dies," which is basically what they did in the sequels. Why would it have been any different if it was Jason Solo, right? Because people wouldn't have had those films or those shows or whatever would have been, adapted from the rest of the EU to build into it. So I think they kind of went in the correct direction. It's the flaw was not having the plan overall. The flaw was not letting The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker naturally come out of the positives and negatives of The Force Awakens, and rather instead trying to build this like tight release window around, okay, we want a Star Wars movie every year and we want a sequel movie every other year. That hamstrung the story, and ultimately they weren't able to really build out more. But I think what I would have done is kind of tried to build out of the spirit of the EU in an adapted form. You would have had to adapt it. You would have had to change things. I think Vong would have been really interesting, but you would have had to change the timeline up and age Luke and Leia more, and you would have had to make Jason and Jane a little bit older for that story. Like, I think all of that could have worked, but you would have had to change things, and therefore you would have had to either retcon the EU or just make it its own universe in general. So that's kind of how I look at how they could have approached the sequel trilogy.
I mean, I have a lot of similar thoughts, but again, critical thinker. I know you brought this up before, but there's like Liam said, there's no realistic way for the EU to be adapted, right? If we want that to happen, I mean, yeah, maybe animated stuff. I'm sure there's people using like Google Veo and ChatGPT, Sora, and everything now to like make these stories, and eventually it'll be so much easier to get all these adaptations that people are still clamoring for, who are still very much tied down to the EU. But why would Disney take from credit of other stories that were made by other creatives and then suddenly be like, "Yeah, no, we're gonna adapt that story," 'cause, a huge thing that Disney has done, unfortunately, is they don't pay their authors, right, for a lot of these books. That's the whole point of, like, the Essential Legends collection is so that you don't have to directly pay them anymore. Right? It's terrible, but that is how Disney has been treating a lot of these EU authors. They don't get their recognition, they don't get their pay. So, this idea that you can adapt it and then also treat these guys right and their stories right and to be in spirit, no. Not as unrealistic, it's just not something the mouse is gonna do. So I'm that's basically my big stance there. Yeah, it'd be nice to have adapted some cool stories out of the EU, and we are seemingly getting some form of that with, like, Heir to the Empire being adapted, because that's such an essential EU story. But I don't look at Legacy of the Force, I don't as like, "Oh, like, that's a big story that, you can walk into with the current ages of the actors from the original trilogy and all that." God, no, right? It's already hard enough for people to deal with a Luke that, you know there are, I believe, a lot of signs of who he is in the original trilogy, but 30 years to jump into that, and suddenly you see him in episode 9, everything's kinda fine again instead of, like, a little bit more nuance, like, "Oh, I'm working back into it." It's not simply that I'm at peace because I'm at Ghost, right? Like, no, it was hard enough there. I think the biggest issue is always execution and not having an overarching plan, like Liam said. My bigger issue is that a lot of the stuff that people were complaining and yapping about in 2015 and 2016, like Borgullet being CGI and all that, kinda came from how Disney let JJ kinda dictate marketing about The Force Awakens, right? Like, we're
True.
doing
Yeah.
Star Wars, and I hate the prequels, but I won't say it out loud, but we're gonna do it practical, on set, and all that. That's stuff that gets people excited, but they don't understand that, like, you can look at stuff like the prequels, with episode 1 especially, it had way more practical effects than any of the original trilogy movies. It had more than 2 of the original trilogy movies combined. right? The most Espa sequence with the audience when you're panning through, that is practical, but you don't know that because all the sets are a lot shinier and smoother and everything. It doesn't really have that lived-in weathered effect that the original trilogy has that makes sense for a galaxy under fastest rule, and you're kinda taking a lot of stories in the Outer Rims. The prequels are not really in the Outer Rims. A lot of it's mid-rims, a lot of it's colonies, a lot of it's the core world. You can't really explain that to people, so yeah, and I know you're saying like, "Oh, the EU, like, being thrown out sucked." Yeah, I'm not gonna deny that, right? And you're saying like, "Oh, the EU also, like, pulled in prequel elements." Yes, but that was a shrinking audience that is all in books. People are not reading books for 30 years straight. It's just not a thing, right? It's very hard for people to be connected to, like, one big story, like a fantasy series, let alone multiple different series with different generation Star Wars characters, and frankly, a lot of that, like, prequel stuff that did come in, people did not love, and a lot of people were turning away from Fate of the Jedi when they heard about Mortis and all the weird stuff with Abeloth and all that. That was a very common refrain, so I get, like, if you're a fan of the EU and you're saying, like, "Oh, but here's an example." Yes, but it's such a small shrinking sample size, and Disney, at the end of the day, does not care about Liam or me or you. They care about the general audience, the people who are looking for the vibes of Star Wars. What, "Oh, that makes me remember this and that." So, yeah, the sequels were gonna happen like they were gonna happen. They just needed way more clarification, way more execution, way more overarching stuff for it to all make sense, and then, frankly, we didn't need to have a film between each of these mainline films. That was a crazy thing to do, looking back at it, to be like, "Yeah, we have Force Awakens, then Rogue One, then Last Jedi, then Solo, then Rise of Skywalker," and then continue doing it every other year. That was crazy for this franchise that has always kinda lived by taking a breath in between. Like, yes, there are things, but the bigger, heavier stories, there's always space, there's always time, there's always events to it, so I like a lot of your ideas. It's just it was already impractical by the end of Legends. So there's no way Disney is gonna be like, "Yeah, even if people don't like the prequels, even if we don't wanna directly reference them, we'll throw a couple bones here and there." No. I remember being very vividly at the after party after the Comic-Con panel for Star Wars: The Force Awakens. They brought us out there to this open air, like, big screen and everything. They're playing all these, like, musical sequences paired with visuals and images of, like, all the old Star Wars movies and characters. Every original trilogy thing, cheer for. Everything from The Force Awakens, big cheer for. Everything from the prequels, people were booing or silent for. I heard people booing scenes with Padme. How are you booing Natalie Portman? But that was the world we lived in 2015. An Oscar winner and Natalie Portman got booed for her role. Right? Like, that's and this is just for people celebrating the music and having a fun after party with all the original trilogy cast kinda there on stage and all that. So, I vividly remember these 10 years of Star Wars, right? Maybe I don't remember 2005 to 15 as much, but 15 to 25, I've seen the changes, I've seen the irony of prequel memes become unironic. I've seen all the changes, I've seen when, frankly, the big upswell for, like, the prequel love came when Battlefront 2 finally brought out Geonosis. That was when everything just lined up right, and that's when it came up, but these ideas, I would love it in a different timeline, but why would Disney do that? They don't seem very interested in that, and currently, with how they're stressing out over the MCU and Star Wars, adding another timeline to this would only be to, like, worsening everything that they're already doing, so that's how I look at it.
But if they had an architect for that separate
If they had an
timeline.
architect, if they had an
No, but
architect.
I mean, in all seriousness, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think and Critical Thinker clarifies that my question was more about the hypothetical, like, what if you could control everything rather than taking into account what audience limitations are or what Disney realistically would do. And I get that, but it is like almost impossible to put
No.
yourself back in 2015 and not be able to like just say, we have to consider what the era was. So, like, that's the thing. If we're talking about 2025, you just, erase the last 10 years and start over, then yes, I would say it would be wonderful to recast and do tell this whole new story. And I again, I think it could work, and I think one day I'll be proved right by that when they do recast and they do tell stories like this, and they do adapt things from Legends, and they do decide to say, "Hey, we have a built-in fan base here." Because one thing I agree with you, Cynic, that like obviously the general audience is what they're trying to appeal to. They're trying to appeal to the most people possible. The only thing I push back on is just the idea of we've seen in the last few years, the last 10 years or the last 5 years post COVID, is that the people who show up every time are the hardcores,
Yeah, that's
and the
true.
hardcores enthusiasm com- like radiating off of people who are generally always enthusiastic and excited about something penetrates into the lesser fandom, right? The fandom that's not as enthusiastic. I think Andor is a great example of that. Andor is something that a lot of general Star Wars fans or general Disney Plus subscribers watched the first 3 episodes, and we constantly heard people say this is boring. And but the Star Wars fans who stuck with it ended up really pushing it into a stratosphere of like, now it's continually talked about as one of the greatest Star Wars things ever. People are constantly going and checking it out who might have never had any interest in it whatsoever. And so I think it is, we've seen this like marriage and this birth of like hardcore dedicated fandom, if you please the things that they are interested in, or just go in that adjacent direction, right? You don't always have to be fan servicey, but if you go in the adjacent direction or adjacent direction of ideas and style and things they want to see, that the fandom wants to see, you're able to pull in general audience because enthusiasm is so high. And I think general audiences get enthused to give a product a chance when the fans are giving it a chance. But when the fans are against it, then they're more likely to say, well, and why would I like it if Liam and Sonic didn't like it? Why would I like it? That's, I think, generally a lot of the direction. So I think that's an interesting way to look at your projects moving forward, is how do we please the fans? How do we tell compelling story? I mean, number one is just tell compelling stories, right? Like nobody was clamoring for Cassian Andor's origin story prior to it being announced. I thought it was a brilliant idea once they announced it, but I didn't think, oh yeah, the one Disney Plus original I want to see is Andor. And then they announced, but when they announced it, I thought it was a really cool idea and a great creative team, and I was excited for it. And then we got proven right that it was really, really good. And I think in today's world, you have to come up with an interesting story first. But if you're able to shift into the direction that people want to see, then I think that's always a positive because you have people on your side already. Now it's just unfortunate in today's reality that like people are so turned off by a lot of the things that have come out in the last few years, and there's such a big divide in this culture war that we're going through, that even when you announce something that should be in the wheelhouse of a lot of fans who should hop on board and be enthusiastic and excited about something, now it's the opposite. Now they're like, well, they can't do the Old Republic, right? Or they can't do Legacy of the Force, or they can't do New Jedi Order, instead of giving it a chance. And the only way to get those people back on board, or make the people who are constant haters seem like constant haters, is to deliver consistent product over and over and over again, to the point where like if you're somebody hating on Star Wars, then you look like a moron versus everybody else because everybody else is loving it, right? And so that's the point they need to get to. And they're not there yet because they have too many inconsistent things. They either have the worst thing you can do for your property is to put out things that are inconsistent and mediocre, because you have some people who love Ahsoka and you have some people who hate it. You have some people who love Obi-Wan and have some people who hate it. You can't put those things out. You need to either put out things that suck or things that are really good. That's just the world we live in nowadays. And so if you put out an Acolyte and like the consensus is that it's not very good, then you move on from that and you don't do it again. But if and you put out an Andor and the consensus is it's great, then you celebrate it. But if you put out Ahsoka, then it's like, okay, well, some people really didn't like it, some people loved it. Do we do a season two? Do we try to make it better? Do we give up on it? Where do we go from here? And I think that's their problem overall. So I say all that, critical thinker. It's a long rant, but like I can't think about 2015 Star Wars without thinking about the fact that the fandom was so anti prequel that you just couldn't go in that direction, and you needed to play it safe. And so I'm not saying I would have played it as safe as The Force Awakens if I was in charge, but I think something in the spirit of the original trilogy that embraced and showed and highlighted all of the wonderful things about the original trilogy cast would have absolutely been the direction I would have gone, because you have to think about obviously making a film that pleases the biggest group of the fans and the most general audiences. And so obviously the fans were clamoring for original trilogy at the time, so you kind of needed to deliver original trilogy. I think the big thing that I would have done differently though is the fact that not just the missed opportunities in the Force Awakens, like not having the big three on screen at all in that film. And again, I also attribute that to The Last Jedi, because they could have done a flashback, but they decided not to because that was the last film Carrie Fisher was alive. They could have done it in one of those two movies. The Force Awakens is obviously the bigger culprit because it was the first one to come out. But either one of those movies could have done all three characters on screen. So to not do that, first of all, then to lead into just small moments of missed opportunity, I think as a fan of everything Star Wars books and prequels and originals at the time, one of the big things I would have done was really showcase those things that people do love about those characters and hope that that enthusiasm from the people who do love the books builds into the people who are never going to read the books and looking at the films as their opportunity to fall in love with those versions of the characters. So I would have used Luke in a way where he's more powerful, shown off the Grandmaster Luke version. I would have really gone into the Jedi stuff and Luke's new Jedi Order and how he built up this group of people and see Luke really succeed, be at the top. And then he falls down throughout the story, but he goes back up again because that's the arc of heroes, right? You have the Han Solo doing his thing, maybe with his family, a little bit, still roguish, but still has a softer spot for the things he's gone through. Leia as a true leader. Like I would have highlighted all of the positives of the characters in that first film, all the things that people loved about those characters from the EU, and told a story around them that brings them to their knees, but they rise back up to the top by the third one. I think that's where you can glean things out of the Vong. It obviously couldn't exactly use that story because it's 19 books long, but you can glean that out of the Vong and bring it back in and be like, let's show the characters at their peak. How do they fall and how do they succeed again? And that would have been where I would have gone, rather than splitting them up, making each one about a different character, and then never really feeling like we got a true sequel because we never got the three, like, we never got a follow-up story for those characters. We got new characters with our old characters sprinkled in. And I think that's the big thing that a lot of people are upset about the sequels. And it's definitely one of the things that's rubbed me the wrong way in the past and still today, is just the fact that the sequels aren't truly sequels. They're like follow-up movies, because they don't tell the stories of Han, Luke, and Leia. A sequel would tell the stories of Han, Luke, and Leia. They're movies that follow new characters with Han, Luke, and Leia as the guides. So that was a long-winded rant. I'm sorry. Sonic, do you want to follow up on that with anything?
No, I mean, I think the only real thing I would have to say is, again, why did we let J.J. Abrams take charge of both Star Trek and Star Wars? Like, he's a Spielberg light. His best film is Super 8, which I love. I do, but even that film has a lot of flaws, right? So he was like the perfect requel director. He was him and Trevorrow with Jurassic World. Like, they just stripped down all the things that were already great about the originals and then missed out on so much of the weight and depth in those, right? In those franchises, in those original films. It's funny to me though that the biggest thing that he's succeeded in is that, like, people are like, "Oh, how could fascism rise up in the galaxy after you defeat the Empire?" As if that didn't happen plenty of times in the EU, but we're seeing it in the real world through so many different totalitarian dictatorships and governments, right? It is about, like, like, it would've been nice if you started off Force Awakens exactly at how it is, and then instead of completely destroying the New Republic, emphasize just how hard it is to keep it down. Like, you have to be vigilant, you have to keep trying, you have to keep connecting with people, you have to keep crossing bridges and then that story becomes a lot more potent with the First Order as an insurgency as opposed to a, "Oh, like, this is just an empire standing," right? And again, I do think a lot of it can be fixed through other mediums, especially animation and all that. I love live action, obviously, in some form, like, not a Andor per se, but, like, other characters that are side characters or characters who just only have cameo appearances in the first 2 films of the sequels that, maybe play a bigger role, and then there's other characters who die off before The Force Awakens, right? Like, I think that would've been great. I think that still can happen, but it is funny that the most unintentional thing that J.J. Abrams did is probably the most ripe and potent for proper storytelling and foundation to be laid out to make the sequel trilogy feel like sequels to some story that will be, at some point, be published, be released with the original trilogy characters, with a bunch of new
True, yeah.
characters in that 30-year gap, then which then leads into this little bridge into the sequels, right? And I think that's what a lot of the post-sequel stuff is definitely gonna harp on a lot more, especially now that we have the context of today's world versus 2013, 2014 when these scripts were being written, and I'm excited for that, right? I really am. I think it's gonna show us a lot of, like, what JJ didn't intend at all, but has actually opened a whole wellspring for. But, yeah, again, I'll say that Vega, I don't understand why you were so happy that, JJ was back. I was happy for the stability. I was not happy for the creativity of that story, right? That was always my fear by the time we came around to 2018, 2019. And I think he did his best, but give him 15, 20 more minutes, I think he would've made a much stronger film even with his limitations as a director, right? So, yeah, I mean, I'm just looking forward to one day Disney figuring out their thing, showing proper respect to John Boyega, finally seeing that Jake the ideal storyteller for his character, he did start him off on the right path.
Yeah, that's, something I hope for too, because it's just we're in this place where, like, the sequel trilogy characters, even though they're not as beloved as the original trilogy characters or the prequel trilogy characters, there are our group of characters we can now grow with and have an EU style universe with because they're the right ages, right? So unless you decide to say, hey, let's just throw these characters away and jump further into the future and start again with new characters, we're stuck with this set of characters who can build out and then really be like a true sequel to the sequels. Because right now we don't have that. And I think, yeah, that's just the unfortunate, like, sad reality of this whole situation. And it's the sad reality of life too. Because if Carrie Fisher didn't pass away, I think in general, the trilogy would have felt a little bit more cohesive. But you
Yeah.
just man, they just bumbled that really. Like, I don't know. I still, again, I'll say it every time, but they should not have killed Luke off. I just think it was a huge mistake with her dead. They knew she died, and she died a year before the movie came out, and they still left that in. I just think it would have helped the movie so much. But anyway, that was a good conversation. Thanks for that question, rants and all. Scrolling back up, we only have about 10 to 15 more minutes left in the stream tonight, everybody. So again, if you have questions, comments, theories, anything you'd like to make sure you get on tonight, send it in. We greatly appreciate your chats. If you'd like to send in a super chat, guarantees you get on the show tonight. Also helps out our channel, which we are definitely thankful for. And you get bumped up to the top. So we will answer yours first. All right, going back into the chat here, we have let's see, where did we leave off? I think it was Critical Thinker saying thoughts on Batman Hush. I think it's overrated. And while there's some fun moments in it, it's not as good a mystery, a story, and a step down from Long Halloween and Dark Victory. Definitely agree with that last point. Not nearly as good as Long Halloween and Dark Victory. I have a soft spot for Hush. It was one of the first comics I read when I was getting back into comics in like seventh grade, right before The Dark Knight Rises came out. A couple of years before that, when I was having my kind of comic resurgence, in anticipation for that film. Hush was one of the first things I read, and I love the art. Obviously, it's Jim Lee art, some of the most iconic visuals in any comic book, any superhero comic book ever. But it is not quite as good as Long Halloween or Dark Victory. I do think it's a valuable story, though. Overrated, sure. I'd have to reread it again. It's one I do actually want to reread because I read it. I haven't read it in years, but I did enjoy it for what it was. I think it's not necessarily a top 10 Batman story, but I think it comfortably is like a top 20 ish story, and it definitely is worth the praise. It's just some people put it in their like top five, and I don't really get that.
Nothing I can add there.
And then I think the next one was also a DC question, was thoughts on Weekly Comic 52. I think it's one of DC's best large scale stories, expands on Infinite Crisis and does a great job giving lesser known characters important things to do. Absolutely agree. It's a really great underrated part of DC. Some people consider it an event. I don't necessarily consider it an event, but it is a wonderful, wonderful story. I'm not sure. Do they have an omnibus reprinted anytime soon? Because I remember that being a really hard one to get. I forked up some money and bought one in 2020 to have it in my collection, but it was a really difficult one to find. But yeah, it's a really good story. Definitely a good one to bring up.
Yeah.
Then Critical Thinker says, remember reading Jedi versus Sith after listening to Path of Destruction and being so surprised the Farfalla ship was just a straight up medieval galleon. Yeah, Jedi versus Sith, honestly, I love the groundwork it laid for that story, but it visually, it's just so out there, especially compared to the Darth Bane trilogy. But, yeah, I don't really love the designs for Farfalla or a lot of the stuff around there. There's some cool ideas around the Jedi Lords and, like, Lord Hoth and stuff like that, but, the visual design around the Jedi and the battleships and everything really in that story, it's too fantasy for me, and Star Wars has to really ride that line between fantasy and sci-fi, but it's so over the top fantasy that it, like, goes into, like, Narnia-esque visuals and truly, like, mythological visuals, which is definitely not something you associate directly with Star Wars.
I agree, and I mean, there is almost that problem too with, like, Tales of the Jedi, but you can at least excuse it because it is genuinely just so many years in the past compared to, what we see here in Jedi versus Sith, so I still do prefer that over, like, a lot of, like, the 2000s comics that were, like, happening with KOTOR where they would just, like, use gunship designs from prequels and all that, just dress it up differently, just trace over, stuff like that. I would always irk me the wrong. I'm like, I get it. There might be a universal design language that transcends centuries, but if it's literally the exact same thing but recolored, that would always piss me off. So I don't mind that because again, it is comics, you can kinda go a little wilder with it, but I do agree, it is that little friction between science fiction and space fantasy that Star Wars learns how to ride and doesn't really ever want to completely jump into one end or the other, but when it does, it shouldn't be to that extent.
Critical Thinker says, I mean, I don't know, the EU immediately threw in tons of prequel tie-ins as soon as those films were out. It wouldn't have been popular at the time, but I think they definitely could have thrown in prequel references. And this isn't our conversation about the sequels. I mean, I guess I won't go into it too long, but yeah, I mean, I agree. They could have thrown in prequel references. They do actually have one prequel reference in The Force Awakens. It's when Kylo says maybe Supreme Leader Snoke should have considered using a clone army. That was about it. And I mean, again, like Sonic referenced earlier, J.J. Abrams was a notorious prequel hater. He did say he was going to put Jar Jar Binks' bones in the desert of Jakku. Like there was just so much hate around there. I think you could have put in prequel references, but there was no way Disney or really anybody who would have been in charge of the sequels at the time outside of George Lucas would have committed a bunch of money to a Star Wars project and then made it in the spirit of the prequels. That's I think what
Yeah.
my point was.
Yeah, I mean, it is it's something I wish more of, and I think we are gonna see definitely more of. I mean, we see a lot of prequel references in, like, Star Wars Resistance, but again, who really sees Star Wars Resistance on Disney XD, right? Not many people. It's definitely one of the least rated and least watched of all the animations. Might be closer to, like, Star Wars Visions viewership than, like, a Bad Batch or Clone Wars for sure.
Let's see, what was the next one? Epic Theory says, "I like Star Wars." Well, I'm glad you like Star Wars, we do too. And said, "Didn't Harry Potter copy the original Star Wars?" I wouldn't say copy, but it's similar, in the, like, chosen one ideology or, like, fantasy based Star Wars storytelling, but like I don't know, so is every myth, right? So is every legend, every fantasy story. So
Yeah.
you could say they all were birthed out of Lord of the Rings, right? So I mean, it's yeah, I wouldn't say it copied Star Wars.
No, definitely not copied. Inspired by, sure, because, that's how art works. It's always a conversation between different artists, between different audiences, and how does that shape and create new things or help you re-understand or reprioritize or reframe stuff. But I don't think so. I don't think Harry Potter is modeled after Luke Skywalker per se, even if they are similarities, because they do have different origins. It's not like, he was fighting, uh, the Professor Quirrell with, uh, Voldemort at the back of his head, and then Voldemort turns around and is like, "No, I am your father." Like, no, wait, no, that didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the most direct similarity you can point to is living with, family who after your parents died type of thing, extended family. But yeah, I don't really see much beyond that. Critical Thinker says an adaptation that EU could have changed things and it was done well enough, people probably would have come around to it eventually. Being in the same continuity as the books wouldn't have worked, but adapting them could have. But yeah, I do agree that killing the EU was more annoying than not connecting the new films to them. Yeah, and that's a big point I want to continue to drive home. It's just the fact that like it's basically impossible to have adapted the EU because adapting the Thrawn trilogy would have been ideal, but the actors were 30 years, 40 years older than they would have been in the Thrawn trilogy. And so de-aging Mark Hamill down from I think he was like 65 when the first film came out, Force Awakens came out. De-aging him from like 65 to 50 isn't that difficult, but de-aging him from 65 to 25 would have been impossible. So you would have had to recast, or you would have had to move the Thrawn trilogy into a time that was incredibly far away from where it was in the EU, which would then obviously retcon the EU, which would then cause problems, right? So there was just literally no way to keep telling stories that would have adapted the EU and keep the EU in the same place. So you would have either had to say these movies don't exist in the EU timeline, which then obviously would separate the two again, even though you added literature to the EU, if they continued to perpetuate literature in the EU and then said, well, the movies are its own thing, but the literature is something else, they could have done that, and that would have been a cleaner break. And then adapted things from the EU like they kind of are now with canon. But there was just no possibility of doing EU stories for the sequel films. It was just impossible with the ages of the actors. And that's just the reality of it. But they definitely could have done a lot better with bringing in stuff that people did love about the EU into their style of storytelling for the sequel trilogy.
Yep, I echo those same thoughts, just it just made sense in 1995, just not in 2015.
Yeah. Um, James Hewitt says 7, 8, and 9 were terrible. Hey, that's your opinion as well. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of 9. I like parts of 8, don't like parts of 8, and 7 I still really like, but yeah, you're definitely not alone with that, James. Critical Thinker says adapting them could. Oh, I already read that. The Epic Theory says we need a KOTOR movie. I think KOTOR is really their key to getting everybody back on board and really delivering us the true Star Wars, Disney Star Wars experience that we could have had. Like I think that's their place where they can still hit this home run with KOTOR and kind of redeem almost everything they've ever done. I truly believe that because if they do KOTOR right, if they do it like we've been suggesting on here for 4 years, um, they could build this whole cinematic universe, this whole multimedia universe, this television universe, however they want to go with it, that's bigger and grander and even more epic than some of the things they did with the sequels or some of the things they did with their other projects. This could be like the truly definitive Disney Star Wars project. It's just something that they absolutely have to know is going to work before they start shooting. Like they got to nail the scripts, they got to nail the direction. They have to completely outline this thing and they just have to commit 100% and say it doesn't matter if we make a movie and it only makes $400 million, we're making a sequel. We're going all in. We don't care. It's kind of like the DC approach right now where they're just like we're all in. Superman could flop, and we're still all in because we need this to eventually work. Obviously, you'll reach a breaking point at some point, but that's the thing that could redeem him. I don't know if a movie is the correct place to do it. It would be awesome to see in a movie, epic in a movie, but I don't know if the style of storytelling for KOTOR and the Old Republic in general fits film.
Yeah, and honestly, I know it's a video game and there's, like, so much more flexibility and all that, but there's a lot of that stuff that doesn't really need huge, huge areas, right? Like, a lot of it is done in the ruins of, like, stuff that happened in the original KOTOR game, right? There's things that they're trying to reference 30 years ago in Tales of the Jedi, which, again, too short of a gap, it never made sense, right? Like, it was supposed to be a Sun Rider, uh, as instead of Bastila Shan, right? Like, it should have been Vima, grown up and continuing Tales of Jedi, all this trademark issues and all that. But ignoring all that aside, like, I yeah, maybe you could see the beginning of KOTOR and the end of KOTOR 1. You could see, like, movie budget level stuff for some of the space battles, Star Forge, but you can do a lot on TV now, and I know streaming has burst. It absolutely has burst, but if you do KOTOR right, you don't really need to do, like, massive sound stages and all that. It doesn't have to look like a Rogue One. It doesn't have to look so, like, pristine and grounded and grimy and expansive. You can make the landscapes do that. You can still use the volume, you can do all these things. It's just it should be an evolution of whatever is done by the end of the Mandoverse. It shouldn't be just like a, "Here's an HBO show that we can make and put 10 episodes, 10 seasons." That's not gonna work either. That doesn't work anymore, right? So, whatever they do, I do still think TV show. I think you could do some nice animated tie-ins if you wanna do, like, stuff like the KOTOR comics be adaptive of some sort. If you wanna do Tales of the Jedi as more like mythology leading into and shaping the KOTOR main storyline, but yeah, movies just not enough to encompass it because it's so character driven. It's so much about the headspace of these characters and the histories that are implied that you slowly uncover for everybody, not just the main character, but every supporting character. So yeah, yeah, it's like you're going through civilizations in KOTOR and seeing how they've been shaped. You don't really see that in the Skywalker saga, even though it absolutely does happen, because you're still centered on, like, movements. There's no real movement in KOTOR. It's people trying to make change and inspire change and go undercover and all that, and for that stuff, I don't think you really need massive, massive movie level budget. You just need a guaranteed 6 seasons, I guess, of, like, 10 episodes each or 7 seasons of 8, and I think that'd be enough to cover the vast majority of what was there in those games.
Well, I think this is gonna be our last question we have time for tonight, and we're gonna finish up with Critical Thinkers question. What do you guys think the next publishing initiative after the High Republic ends should be? And that's a great question because we are wrapping up the High Republic in the next few weeks. We actually just got our audio review copy for Trials of the Jedi, so looking forward to getting that out for you all. We'll try to have that one out by the time the book comes out, working on Shadows of the Empire right now for your review as well. But in regards to the High Republic, I don't think they're going to like end it there. I think it's been a big enough success that they'll continue with other spin-off stories. They'll try to build out and continue to flesh out the world between the end of Trials of the Jedi and not just the acolyte wayseeker that we just read, but the acolyte in general. Get a little bit closer to the force. I mean, the Phantom Menace. Try to continue to build that bridge, and I think kind of almost take over for what the acolyte was doing, and try to finish connecting to the Phantom Menace. I do think they'll have sporadic stories like that. I don't think it'll be full initiatives. Like I don't know if they'll go phase 4, but I think they will release like standalone High Republic books from here on out. I think the ideal place to go, in my opinion, would be New Republic, and just tell the stories of the original trilogy characters, tell the stories of some big characters in that time, really continue to enhance that storyline. I know they want to save everything for the films and TV shows, and I would love if they recast it and they really went in all in with the original trilogy characters and told their stories, but I don't know if they're going to do that. And if they're not, I just want those stories told. I want the bridge between the original trilogy and the sequels, and the only way we can start doing that is by adding some multimedia as well. Like they can't tell all of it in film, so whether it's like a Luke's Jedi Order story, like go and do something in the vein of Young Jedi Knights and tell the story of Padawans and apprentices and Luke's Jedi Order. Get to know Luke a little bit better during that time. Do something in the New Republic. I think that would be the next best thing. Then second direction I would go if they didn't do that is post Rise of Skywalker, which again is another thing I think they're saving for films and TV. But we are getting our first post Rise of Skywalker story in a book this year. Go there, try to enhance the characters of Rey, Finn, and Poe, try to get us to fall in love with those characters and try to get us to appreciate and enjoy that time period a little bit more and just push and push and push, especially if Rey's New Jedi Order is still taking place 15 years after the Rise of Skywalker, and especially if we don't really have any stories that take place immediately after Rise of Skywalker outside of whatever Starfighter is going to be. I don't know if that's really going to crisscross with sequel characters. Then really build up that time period, get us ready for those films by diving into those characters. So I think that's the second place I would go. And the final place I would go would be to take a step ahead of the High Republic. Go a little bit closer to Darth Bane. I know we've talked about in the past basically the medieval times type of stories that you could tell in that era and like the push into the rest of the galaxy. And phase two kind of does that in the High Republic, but I think taking a step further, right? Like a true age of exploration. The High Republic kind of is that with like mapping of hyper routes. And the High Republic phase two really does have the Jedi embracing and really pushing forward and becoming way seekers and traveling and experiencing the galaxy a little bit more. But I'd love to see the true expansion. So I think that's the direction I would go. I wouldn't go all the way up to Bane because I think ideally you go back and you do the Old Republic first and you tell the Old Republic story, and Bane kind of comes out of whatever storytelling you're doing with Old Republic in canon. And then you connect truly Bane to High Republic. But I think taking a step where like it's 300, 400 years before High Republic, you could tell a few interesting stories, maybe not quite as big as the High Republic, but you could tell maybe a year or 2 years worth of interesting stories about the age of expansion and really pushing into the galaxy and trying to spread the Jedi message and the Republic message and trying to get people to join the Republic. I think that type of stuff could be kind of interesting, but that would be my last choice. Yeah, technical issue.
Hello? Okay.
You're robotic.
Give 1 second.
We're both robotic now.
1 minute, guys, just as we get through.
Oh, I can hear myself now.
Yeah, but, yeah, I guess the era that I think just has been super underdeveloped is Dark Times. Nobody's ever really touched it. I think we can stuff like 20, 30 years of storytelling in there. No, just kidding. No, obviously, that's like the one thing Disney has absolutely nailed compared to even EU. And yeah, you can say some of the comics, like the actual Dark Times comic and all that were like really good. And there's some stuff like The Last of the Jedi junior novels. Sure, all that is fine. But, yeah, I mean, Disney has proven that they can master that. It was, like, an era that wasn't 100% set to stone, like, the stages of getting into the proper rebellion, and they're almost done, right? After Andor, there's really not much left. It's really just, like, Cal Kestis' story, some stuff with the Path, and Ventress and Quinlan, and you could honestly just be like, "Alright, yeah, I could see Obi-Wan's force training somewhere else, and you'll be done." So, my first priority like Liam said, New Republic, make it more multimedia, and New Republic leading into Mandoverse. That's still 4 to 5 years at minimum, right? There's so much potential there, and you could have the original trilogy characters do all their things and then start taking the step back, and there's so much implication, stuff like Shadow of the Sith and all that. It's great that we finally have the Tom Segura run started, so now we can be like or Alex Segura run started that you're like, "Okay, yes, awesome." We get to see all these characters that, yeah, they were in the other comic lines, but now we get to see what the original trilogy characters were doing after they're in the establishment, after they're on top, right? And I'm excited for the run. I'm excited what they're gonna do with that. But it's surprising to me that we don't have books connecting to that you can take a lot of these comic book characters and all that and kinda jump between these mediums, right? Like, books and comics as different as they might be in a franchise like Star Wars, I don't think is that hard of a jump to make, especially if you know these books that you're gonna be writing are not necessarily gonna be driven by these comic characters, right? Like, it'll be informed by, it'll reflect, it'll react to stuff like that. But you know eventually the Mandoverse stuff is gonna kick in, and that's gonna be way more important. And then whenever we do get a recast of Luke, Han, and Leia, right, they will be a step removed from what we knew of them in the original trilogy, but they'll still be familiar, right? So I don't understand why we haven't gone with books to like really set up a lot of the different things like Moff Gideon, set up stuff like the Shadow Council, set up stuff with how the New Republic's amnesty program works and all that. Like there is so much rich storytelling, especially now that we have Andor as like a kind of a parallel to what we're seeing with Mon Mothma's performance in Ahsoka and what's going on there, like, there's so much you can do, right? I mean, frankly, this is a great, great time to see Ahsoka and Sabine's training be done in a book or something, right? Like, I'd love something like that to come out. I'm surprised we haven't, right? Like, that 5 years before is so potent for setting the stage of the galaxy now that we know that the Mandalorian is not just some cowboy in shiny armor. He's become way bigger. He is now a movie character. So then treat all that stuff with these other movie characters that have been well established, that have been hidden away, so that you can kind of more easily segue into them, and then when these characters do pop up, you understand, like at least some people understand, like, "Oh, because they did that. Oh, they're following that." Like, we don't know what Luke and Han and Leia really were doing when anytime they're referenced or show up in the New Republic era so far. Like, they get to steal some scenes, they get to have some nice little fun cameos and bits and pieces there, but they're not there. They're not actively shaping stuff yet. And if you want, people to be prepared for that, you kinda almost have to get them, like, re-ingratiated with kinda storytelling that is with them as the leaders. And I don't think it should be like the EU where when Han and everyone are, like, 16, 17, they're still deciding, they're still shaping stuff, like, Luke is almost like a nuclear deterrent. I don't love that stuff, especially when it got that far in the EU and you're like, "Well, when does the next generation truly step up with the remnants of, like, the Vong War and everything going on there?" I did not love that, right? It felt like Ben Skywalker was gonna be the first real character who was gonna be able to have that opportunity that, Jason never truly got to have, Anakin obviously didn't have, Jaina completely unresolved, but somehow becomes the first empress of a new empire, like, yeah, I have a lot about the imperial friendliness that really starts popping up towards the later EU, but my bigger issue was always that these older generations stayed in power. It's kinda realistic for our world, don't get me wrong, but, it's not very appealing as a story to, like, be able to say, like, "When does Star Wars continue and move on?" But in this little pocket there before Mandoverse, yes, absolutely, that should be the first spot. Like Liam said also, right after, everything to do with The Rise of Skywalker, so, you have a couple years to play around with. Starfighter is not gonna shape everything about the First Order, Final Order stuff, right? Like, that will not happen. But you can at least lay the stages for more storytelling, new characters, and stuff that maybe do appear years later, like a Black Chrysanthemum did in the comics, and then finally shows up in Book of Boba Fett. That's ripe, so ripe to tell very mature, almost like, Mask of Fear storytelling with, like, the understanding of, like, this already happened once and now it happened again, and why did we not stop it this time? What's different? Like, this is a great opportunity to start differentiating now that there's time, there's space, now that we know that hopefully Palpatine doesn't come back in, like, 1 or 2 years like another Dark Empire, right? So, I'd say those are my top 2. My 3rd would be doing Tales of the Jedi, original Tales of the Jedi, and if you're not gonna connect it to KOTOR, treat it as a mythology that KOTOR TV show kind of leans on references, has, like, imagery from and all that. Make it feel like that true fantasy of Star Wars that can now be, like, a little bit of a bridge between KOTOR and then everything that's happening with Dawn of the Jedi, right? So that way it has its own independent flavor, but doesn't have to be tied down and work as, like, a little piece of story that supposedly is important like it is in the original KOTOR, where it's only 30 years before. It doesn't work. It really does not work. How does an Exar Kun, Eula sleeper ships, different star systems, how does that match up to anything in KOTOR, which especially by KOTOR 2 is very, very prequel coded? Not really. So, treat it as its own, like, mini era, just a couple years like High Republic was, but a little more simplified, just about a main group of characters, kinda like how Star Wars Legacy comics were, and then bam. You'll be done with that, and then you can connect it, bridge to it, do whatever you want. I think that'd be fun.
Well, that's going to wrap up our stream tonight, everybody. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and for joining us this week. Make sure you join us next week. If you didn't get your question on tonight, make sure you save it. Come back next week. We're live every single Tuesday at 7 p.m. Pacific time. Make sure you join us for our stream next week, where we'll be going over whatever the news is, whatever topics we haven't yet covered over the last few weeks, and taking your guys' questions and comments and all that jazz next week. So make sure you like the video. If you haven't, we have way more people watching right now than have liked the video. So if you want to do us one last favor before we wrap up the stream, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and again, join us every week. We do have videos that come out every single Friday with some other videos sprinkled throughout the week. Currently working on some book reviews for you all, as well as some other videos that are in the works. So keep an eye on the channel for all that. Shorts come out 3 days a week, every week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We also have polls twice a week, or twice a day, every day. So you can check those out every single day of the week and vote on your favorite Star Wars characters and favorite Star Wars films and TV shows. Thank you so much for watching tonight's stream, everybody, and we will see you all next week.